Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable, settle back, and let the ordinary noises around you fade a little. Because tonight we're going back to an American evening when the most dangerous object in the house seemed to be a wooden box sitting quietly in the corner of the living room. It had no flashing screen, it had no photographs. It could not show you a map, replay a recording, or place a warning across the bottom of the picture. It had a dial, a speaker covered with cloth, and a voice that people had learned to trust. On the night we were about to enter, that voice told them something impossible. Something had fallen from the sky. Strange creatures had emerged from it. The army was being overwhelmed. New Jersey was burning. And for a short, confusing stretch of time, some Americans believed that the end of the world had arrived between supper and bedtime. Before we go any further, tell me something. What time is it where you are and where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're lying in bed with the room already dark. Maybe you're sitting at a desk finishing one last thing before sleep. Perhaps this story is playing through a pair of headphones while everyone else in the house has gone quiet. Wherever you are, take a moment to notice how quickly you could check whether a frightening report was true. You could open another website, look at your phone, search for a live video, read official statements, or message someone standing close to the place where the event was supposed to be happening. In 1938, an ordinary listener had far fewer choices. If the radio said something terrible was unfolding, you could turn the dial and hope another station knew more. You could telephone a relative, assuming the lines were not busy. You could call the police, assuming someone answered. Or you could sit beside that wooden cabinet and continue listening as the announcer's voice became more urgent. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy stepping into the small rooms where history felt immediate and personal, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribed and gave the video a like. You do not have to do it before we begin. Wait until something in this story makes you pause, or makes you imagine what you might have done in that same situation. And while you are getting comfortable, let us turn the dial backward to Sunday evening, October 30th, 1938. It was the night before Halloween, although most Americans did not expect anything especially frightening from the radio. Sunday evenings were familiar territory. Families had eaten supper, dishes were being cleared, children were preparing for school the next morning. Fathers loosened collars, mothers finished household tasks, and neighbours might stop by for conversation before the work week began again. In cities, apartment windows glowed above crowded streets. In small towns, the business districts were mostly quiet. Cars passed occasionally on dark roads, their headlights making narrow tunnels through the night. There were no strange lights moving across the sky, no crowds staring upward, and no military vehicles racing toward New Jersey. At least not yet. Inside millions of homes, radios were warming up. That detail matters. A radio set did not always spring instantly to life when someone turned the knob. The tubes inside needed a little time to heat, and then the speaker would begin to hum, crackle, and gather distant voices from the air. A hand moved slowly across the dial, passing through music, sermons, comedy programs, advertisements, and news. Reception might fade and return. Static might interrupt a sentence. Yet when the signal was clear, the voice coming through the speaker felt remarkably close. An announcer sitting hundreds of miles away could sound as if he were speaking directly from the cabinet in your living room. At 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the Columbia Broadcasting System began transmitting an episode of the Mercury Theatre on the air. It was a dramatic program led by a 23-year-old actor and director named Orson Welles. That evening's production was an adaptation of H.G. Wells's novel The War of the Worlds, a story first published at the end of the 19th century about Martians invading England. For the radio version, writer Howard Koch and the Mercury Theatre team moved the action to the United States, placing the first landing near the real community of Grover's Mill, New Jersey. The production used 10 actors, a 27-piece orchestra, and a carefully arranged series of simulated news reports that made the fictional disaster sound disturbingly similar to an actual emergency broadcast. The programme announced what it was. There was no secret conspiracy at the network, no government experiment, and no plan to convince the country that Martians had truly arrived. At the beginning, listeners were told that they were hearing a presentation of the War of the Worlds. Orson Welles introduced the story in his deep, controlled voice, and anyone who remained with the program from its first moments had reason to understand that it was a drama. But people do not always arrive at the beginning of a radio show. Some families had been listening to another network. The most popular competing program at that hour featured the ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his wooden dummy Charlie McCarthy, an arrangement that sounds slightly strange for radio until you remember that Americans loved them. Bergen could make millions of people laugh with a ventriloquist act they could not actually see, which may be one of the best demonstrations of how willing radio audiences were to use their imagination. Listeners heard the setup, pictured the expression on the dummy's face, and supplied the missing stage for themselves. A musical interlude or less interesting portion of Bergen's program gave some listeners a reason to turn the dial. They arrived at CBS several minutes after the War of the Worlds had begun. They missed the announcement that identified the program as fiction. What they heard instead was ordinary dance music from an orchestra, supposedly performing in a hotel ballroom. That choice was important. The broadcast did not begin with screaming Martians, roaring machines, or an actor announcing that the planet was under attack. It began with something dull enough to feel real. Music played. An announcer spoke calmly. The evening appeared normal. Then the program interrupted itself with a report from an observatory. Astronomers had noticed unusual explosions on the surface of Mars. The music returned. A few minutes later, another interruption came. A large object, perhaps a meteorite, had fallen on a farm near Grover's Mill. A reporter was being sent to the scene. There was no immediate declaration of invasion. There was only an unusual event, then a second unusual event, each delivered in the language of professional broadcasting. The story advanced the way real news often advances, one incomplete piece at a time. Picture an ordinary family hearing this. The father reaches toward the radio and turns the volume slightly higher. Someone washing dishes in the kitchen pauses to listen. A child asks what happened, and an adult says it is probably nothing. The music continues, so the conversation in the room resumes. Then the announcer returns. Now there is a crowd at the farm. The object in the field is not shaped like an ordinary meteorite. It appears metallic. The end of it is beginning to move. Police officers push spectators back. The reporter speaks from close to the scene, describing what he sees as though he is trying to understand it at the same moment as the listener. His delivery is not the booming voice of a theatrical villain. It is the uncertain voice of a working journalist confronted with something he cannot explain. Then the object opens. At this point it is worth remembering that the audience could see nothing. Every image had to be created inside the listener's mind. That limitation made the radio less visually complete than a motion picture, but it also gave the production a strange advantage. No costume could look cheap, no painted backdrop could wobble, no rubber Martian could disappoint the audience. The creature emerging from the cylinder looked exactly as frightening as each listener was capable of imagining. A weapon appeared. A beam of heat swept across the field. Men fell. Cars, trees, and surrounding objects caught fire. The reporter's description broke apart, and the transmission from the scene suddenly ended. Silence followed. Not comfortable silence. Not the ordinary pause between lines. The microphone at the scene had apparently gone dead. For listeners who believed they were hearing a news broadcast, that silence carried its own message. Something had happened to the reporter. Something had happened to everyone standing near him. The network did not immediately explain that an actor had stopped speaking according to a script. Instead, the program moved to another announcement, another official voice, another fragment of information. The fictional crisis expanded outward from one field in New Jersey. The Mercury Theatre had found the precise weakness in radio's authority. People trusted the medium partly because they could not see how it was made. A newspaper showed ink on paper. A film announced itself through the visible artifice of actors and sets. Radio arrived without a body. The voice simply entered the house. You did not see the announcer reading from a page. You did not see the actor waiting for his cue. You did not see a man crouched beside a sound effects table, producing the noises of destruction. The machinery remained hidden, so the result could feel strangely pure. These did not mean that every person listening became convinced that aliens were invading. Most did not. Many understood that the program was fictional. Some tuned in late, became confused briefly, and then learned the truth. Others recognised Orson Welles or the Mercury Theatre format. The later image of an entire nation racing into the streets was greatly exaggerated, especially by newspapers that were competing with radio for advertising and public influence. Yet the opposite claim, that nobody was frightened and the whole event was invented afterward, is also too simple. Letters, police records, telephone reports, and complaints sent to federal regulators show that real listeners did mistake parts of the broadcast for an actual emergency, and that some communities experienced genuine confusion. In Trenton, New Jersey, the city manager later reported that police communication lines had been overwhelmed by roughly 2,000 calls during a 2-hour period. The truth lies in that uncomfortable middle ground. America did not rise as one terrified body and flee from Martians, but enough people believed enough of the broadcast for enough minutes to create one of the most famous nights in media history. Those minutes are what matter to us tonight. Imagine not knowing how the story ends. Forget the photographs of a young Orson Welles facing reporters the next day. Forget the newspaper headlines, the investigations, the academic arguments, and the decades of jokes about foolish listeners. Sit instead inside the first confusion. A woman in Newark hears that poisonous gas is spreading. Her husband is working an evening shift somewhere across town. She reaches for the telephone. A family in Pennsylvania hears military units being destroyed in New Jersey. New Jersey is not another country. It is not a distant battlefield described on a map. It is close enough that an invasion there might reach Pennsylvania before morning. A listener in New York hears reports of refugees and smoke. He goes to the window, although the view outside can tell him almost nothing. Someone calls a police station. Someone telephones a newspaper office. Someone tries to reach relatives near the reported landing site. Someone turns to another station, hears ordinary music or comedy, and becomes even more confused. Would another network continue with scheduled entertainment if the country were under attack? Perhaps the emergency had not reached them yet. Perhaps CBS had received the news first. Perhaps the government was trying to prevent panic. Once fear begins supplying explanations, almost any missing piece can be made to fit. That is one of the most human parts of this story. People did not need to be stupid to become frightened. They only needed to enter the program at the wrong moment, trust the form of what they were hearing, and lack an immediate way to verify it. The broadcast copied the signals by which radio told listeners that something important was happening. It interrupted music. It shifted between locations. It used reporters, experts, government officials, military descriptions, and broken transmissions. The performance sounded less like a traditional play and more like the radio coverage of a crisis unfolding faster than anyone could control. Americans in 1938 already knew that regular programming could be interrupted by terrible news. They had spent much of that year hearing about international tension in Europe. Adolf Hitler's Germany had grown increasingly aggressive. Only a month earlier, the Munich crisis had filled broadcasts and newspapers with fears that another European war might begin. Families remembered the First World War, and many adults listening that night had lived through it. They understood gas attacks, artillery, armies collapsing, refugees filling roads, and governments issuing urgent announcements. Martians were imaginary, but the structure of sudden catastrophe was not. The country was also still carrying the weight of the Great Depression. Conditions had improved from the worst years, but unemployment remained high. Savings had vanished for many families, and confidence in ordinary stability was fragile. People had already learned that institutions could fail, banks could close, jobs could disappear, and a safe life could change with very little warning. A voice announcing that the world had become dangerous was not speaking to an audience unfamiliar with fear. Still, the evening had begun normally. That contrast made the reports more effective. One moment there was music, the next there was a strange object in a field. Soon soldiers were being sent toward it, then the soldiers were gone. The fictional news moved quickly, perhaps too quickly if a listener had stopped to examine the timeline. Armies mobilized, battles occurred, and destruction spread across New Jersey within minutes. Yet fear rarely takes out a pencil and checks travel times. It does not pause to calculate whether military units could have reached Grover's Mill so rapidly. It hears a voice losing control and reacts to the emotion before it tests the logistics. The production itself had come close to being much less memorable. During rehearsals, members of the Mercury Theatre were reportedly dissatisfied with the script. H.G. Wells's original novel was respected, but turning its long narrative into an hour of radio was difficult. The early version sounded flat. Howard Koch had only a short time to complete the adaptation, and the company continued revising and rehearsing as the broadcast approached. The decision to imitate live news coverage gave the story its force. What might have been a conventional science fiction play became something that sounded as if fiction had climbed out of the radio schedule and taken control of the network. The Library of Congress later described the broadcast as one of the most famous entertainment radio programs ever made, and it was selected for preservation in the National Recording Registry. No one in the studio could see the entire reaction while the program was still on the air. The actors stood before microphones holding scripts. Musicians waited for cues. Technicians watched levels and timing. Orson Welles directed the performance while also playing the central narrator, Professor Richard Pearson. Outside the studio, telephone calls began reaching CBS. Network employees realised that listeners were asking whether the reports were real. Think about that moment from inside the control room. You are producing a dramatic programme. Everyone involved knows it is a dramatic programme. The title was announced. The network has identified the series. The script contains Martians. Then messages begin arriving that police departments, newspapers, and frightened listeners are calling. At first, the reaction might seem almost flattering. The performance is convincing. The actors have done their job, but there is a point where convincing becomes dangerous, where applause is replaced by the realization that people outside the studio are not enjoying the illusion. They are acting on it. CBS inserted announcements clarifying that the broadcast was fictional. The program continued. Its structure eventually shifted away from rapid news bulletins and became more obviously dramatic, following Professor Pearson through the aftermath of the imagined invasion. Listeners who stayed with it heard the story reveal itself. The Martians, after defeating human weapons, were themselves defeated by ordinary earthly bacteria, just as they had been in H.G. Wells's novel. But for some people, the clarification came after the fear. That is the strange power of the night. The misunderstanding did not need to last an hour. It did not even need to last half an hour. A few minutes can be enough when you believe your family is in danger. A person can grab a coat, wake a child, fill a car, run to a neighbour, or make a desperate telephone call long before a calm announcer returns to explain that the invasion exists only inside a studio. Later, newspapers would publish dramatic accounts of panic. Headlines described terror across the country. Stories told of people fleeing homes, preparing for death, crowding roads, and praying in churches. Some of those reports were based on genuine incidents. Others grew in the telling. Radio had become a powerful competitor to newspapers, and publishers had a reason to portray the newer medium as irresponsible and dangerous. The legend expanded until the phrase War of the Worlds no longer referred only to H.G. Wells's novel or Orson Welles's production. It referred to the night Americans supposedly lost their minds. The real story is more interesting than that legend, because it is not about a foolish population unable to distinguish Martians from reality. It is about trust. It is about how information enters a home and how quickly an authoritative voice can rearrange the emotional life of everyone inside it. It is about a new medium discovering that realism could carry consequences. It is about an anxious country hearing the familiar language of breaking news attached to an impossible event. Most of all, it is about the people beside the radios. Return to one of those rooms now. The set rests on a table against the wall. Its dial gives off a weak amber glow. A parent leans closer to the speaker, one hand holding the edge of a chair. A child watches the parent rather than the radio, because children often understand danger by studying adult faces. No one in the room has seen a Martian. No one has heard an explosion outside. The street remains calm. Yet the announcer knows names, places, military units, roads, observatories, and government offices. He sounds informed. He sounds close to the event. He sounds afraid. The family must decide whether to believe him. That decision is the doorway into everything that follows. Before we reach the farm at Grover's Mill, before the cylinder opens and the heat ray crosses the field, before telephones begin ringing in police stations and newspaper offices, we need to understand why the radio had earned such authority in the first place. It was not merely an appliance people used for entertainment. By 1938, it had become the national fireplace, the object families gathered around to hear presidents speak, comedians perform, orchestras play, and reporters describe a world that seemed to be changing every week. For years, the voice inside that cabinet had brought news from distant cities directly into ordinary homes. It had explained bank failures, elections, storms, fires, strikes, sporting events, and the growing danger overseas. It had comforted people during the Depression and given lonely evenings a schedule. Americans had learned when to laugh, when to listen, and when to become quiet. Then, on one Sunday night in October, the trusted voice cleared its throat and announced that something had fallen into a field in New Jersey. Before anyone could mistake a fictional invasion for real news, Americans first had to learn that the radio was worth believing. That trust did not appear suddenly on the night of October 30th, 1938. It had been built slowly over nearly 2 decades, one election result, weather report, baseball game, presidential address, and household evening at a time. By the late 1930s, the radio was no longer an exciting machine owned mainly by hobbyists who understood wires, batteries, and homemade antennas. It had become an ordinary part of American life, as familiar in many homes as the kitchen table, the alarm clock, or the family photograph standing on the mantel. Go back to the beginning of that transformation, and the difference is striking. In the early 1920s, radio broadcasting was still uncertain. A person interested in receiving signals might assemble a crystal set, stretch an antenna across a room or yard, place headphones over the ears, and carefully adjust a small piece of wire until a weak voice or distant music emerged from the static. Only one person could listen comfortably at a time. The sound faded easily. A nearby electrical appliance or storm could fill the headphones with noise. There were no established schedules telling listeners exactly when their favourite programmes would begin, and many stations appeared briefly before disappearing just as quickly. Yet the experience felt almost miraculous. A voice had travelled through the air without a physical wire connecting speaker and listener. Music performed in another building entered the home instantly. Election results could arrive before the morning newspaper. A farmer miles from the nearest large town could hear market prices, weather information, and entertainment without leaving his property. The earliest receivers demanded patience, but the reward was a connection to places that had previously felt very far away. Commercial broadcasting expanded rapidly after station KDKA in Pittsburgh transmitted election returns in November 1920. Hundreds of stations followed during the next several years. Churches, department stores, newspapers, colleges, manufacturers, and individual entrepreneurs all experimented with broadcasting. Some programs lasted only a few minutes. Others included live music played by anyone available near the microphone. An announcer might read news from the newspaper, give the weather, introduce a singer, and remind the audience which company had provided the equipment. The industry had not yet decided what radio should sound like, so it tried almost everything. At first, the radio itself remained expensive enough to be a serious household purchase. Families did not pick one up casually with the week's groceries. A good cabinet set could represent weeks of wages, and some required separate batteries that had to be recharged or replaced. The machine was often placed where visitors could see it, because ownership suggested that a household was modern and connected. Wooden cabinets were designed to resemble respectable furniture rather than laboratory equipment. Manufacturers understood that the radio needed to look comfortable beside a lamp and upholstered chair. It could not continue appearing like a pile of electrical parts brought in from a workshop. Speakers improved, controls became easier to operate, and sets became more reliable. Instead of one person listening through headphones, an entire family could hear the same program together. This changed the social meaning of the machine. Radio was no longer a private experiment. It became a group activity. Chairs were turned toward it. Children were told to settle down when a program began. Conversation stopped when an important announcement came through. The radio did not merely enter the living room, it gradually reorganized the room around itself. The growth continued even during the Great Depression. In 1930, around 12 million American households owned radios. By 1939, the total had risen to more than 28 million. Ownership went from roughly 40% of households at the beginning of the decade to close to 90% by its end. Although radios remained less common in some poor and isolated rural areas, particularly in the South. The Depression slowed many industries, but it did not stop Americans from buying radios. People who were forced to reduce spending still regarded the set as one of the few purchases that could bring years of news and entertainment into the house without requiring the price of a theatre ticket each evening. That fact is worth considering carefully. The 1930s were not a period when most families had money to waste. Millions had lost jobs, homes, farms, savings, or businesses. Men stood in relief lines. Families moved in with relatives. Children wore repaired clothing and learned not to ask for things their parents could not provide. In that world, the radio offered an extraordinary amount of experience from a single object. Once the set was purchased and electricity was available, a family could hear comedy, drama, music, sports, sermons, political speeches, educational talks, and advertising without paying separately for each program. A radio could fill an otherwise quiet evening. It could make a small apartment feel connected to Broadway, Washington, Chicago, Hollywood, or a ballpark several states away. It could bring an orchestra into a farmhouse where no one had ever attended a concert. It could let a child follow the adventures of a masked hero while sitting beside a coal stove. It could give an unemployed worker a few minutes of laughter at the end of a day spent searching for a job. This did not mean that every home listened in the same way. In a prosperous household, the radio might be a polished floor model standing in a formal living room. In a working-class apartment, it might be a smaller table, set purchased on installments. Rural families without electrical service could use battery-powered receivers, although maintaining the batteries added expense and inconvenience. Some neighbours gathered in the home of the family that owned the best set. Boarding houses placed radios in common rooms. Restaurants, stores and bars kept them playing for customers. The audience extended beyond the number of machines because one machine could serve many people. Programming became organised around the daily routine of the household. In the morning, stations offered news, weather, exercise programs, music and practical information. Daytime schedules increasingly aimed at women working in the home, with serial dramas, cooking discussions, childcare advice, health talks, household information, and programs built around the sale of soap, food, medicine, and cleaning products. The connection between serialised domestic drama and soap advertising became so strong that the programmes acquired the name soap operas. Radio did not simply entertain the people inside the home, it learned their schedules and followed them through the day. During the late afternoon, children took their turn. They followed cowboys, detectives, aviators, adventurers and secret clubs. Programmes encouraged them to send away for badges, decoder rings, photographs and membership cards, often by mailing a product label or box top to the sponsor. A child could listen each day, memorise the opening music, repeat the sponsor's slogan, and feel part of a national group of listeners who knew the same characters and waited for the same cliffhanger. Evening brought the family audience together. Comedy and variety programmes attracted enormous followings. Amos and Andy, despite being rooted in racial stereotypes and minstrelsy traditions, became one of the earliest national radio sensations. Jack Benny developed jokes around his fictional cheapness, his old automobile and his poor violin playing. Eddie Cantor, Fred Allen, George Burns, Gracie Allen and other performers created personalities that entered American homes week after week. Listeners knew the voices, repeated the catchphrases, and recognised the supporting characters before their names were announced. Music remained central. Dance bands broadcast from hotels and ballrooms, singers performed live, classical orchestras reached audiences far beyond the concert hall. Rural listeners heard country music, barn dance programs, and regional performers. Immigrant communities could find stations broadcasting in Yiddish, Italian, Polish, Spanish, German, and other languages, particularly in large cities where local broadcasters served neighbourhoods that national programmes often overlooked. In the 1930s and 1940s, many local stations carried programming created specifically for immigrant audiences, making the radio both a national medium and a neighbourhood one. Sports became especially powerful because radio allowed listeners to experience an event as it happened. A baseball announcer did not merely list the score. He described the pitcher's movements, the batter stepping toward the plate, the crowd rising, and the ball travelling into the outfield. Listeners supplied the picture themselves. They learned to recognise tension from the speed of the announcer's voice. A pause could mean the ball was still in the air. A sudden shout could bring people out of chairs before the play had been completely described. Radio taught Americans to respond emotionally to voices they could not see. That habit would become essential to the War of the Worlds broadcast. Listeners learned that vocal details carried information. A calm voice meant events were under control. A hurried voice suggested that something unexpected had happened. Static might indicate distance. An interrupted signal implied trouble. A reporter speaking over noise sounded close to the action. These were not formal rules explained to the audience. People absorbed them by listening night after night. The medium also trained them to expect interruptions. A scheduled programme could be stopped for an election result, a major crime, a political development, a disaster, or news from overseas. The interruption itself became a sign of importance. Ordinary broadcasting had been pushed aside because something more urgent demanded attention. The announcer's tone changed. Entertainment gave way to information. Listeners leaned toward the speaker. Nothing built the authority of the radio more effectively than Franklin D. Roosevelt. When Roosevelt entered the White House in March 1933, the banking system was in crisis. Banks had failed across the country. Depositors feared that their savings would disappear. State governments had declared bank holidays, and the new administration temporarily closed banks nationwide, while officials examined which institutions could safely reopen. On March 12th, Roosevelt addressed the public by radio. He explained what had happened to the banks, why the closure had been necessary, and what the government was doing. He did not sound as though he were delivering a distant ceremonial speech to a crowd. He spoke in a steady, conversational manner, using language intended for ordinary listeners. The address became known as the first of his fireside chats, although that label was not used during the broadcast itself. His approach made millions of Americans feel that the president was speaking directly to them, rather than through a newspaper editor or political intermediary. Picture what that meant inside a home where money had become a source of daily fear. A husband and wife sat near the radio with unpaid bills on the table. Perhaps their bank had closed. Perhaps their savings represented 10 or 20 years of work. They could not travel to Washington and question the president. They might not fully understand banking reserves, currency shortages, or federal policy. Then Roosevelt's voice entered the room and explained the problem in terms intended to make sense. Whether listeners agreed with his politics or not, the experience changed the relationship between national leadership and the public. Earlier presidents had appeared in newspapers, newsreels, public speeches, and formal statements. Roosevelt could arrive in the home without waiting for anyone else to interpret him. His voice came through the same speaker that carried comedy and music, but when he began speaking, the room became serious. The expression fireside chat captured the intimacy of the experience, even though Roosevelt was not casually sitting beside every listener's fireplace. The phrase described how the broadcast felt. He sounded close. He addressed the public as people capable of understanding difficult problems. He acknowledged fear and tried to replace it with explanation. During later talks, he discussed economic recovery, government programs, drought, unemployment, foreign affairs, and eventually war. The radio became the place where Americans expected the president to tell them what was happening. That expectation extended beyond Roosevelt. Government officials, experts, military officers, religious leaders, and journalists all used the medium. The microphone gave their words a directness that print could not reproduce. A newspaper reader could stop, reread, question, or turn the page. Radio moved forward continuously. The listener had to follow the voice at its pace. Miss a sentence, and it was gone. There was no recording to replay in the average home. Live broadcasting added another layer of authority. Most programs were performed as listeners heard them. Actors stood at microphones in studios. Musicians waited nearby. Sound effects workers handled doors, bells, telephones, gravel boxes, sheets of metal, and other equipment used to create places that did not physically exist. Mistakes remained possible. An actor could stumble. A sound cue could arrive late. A singer could miss a note. That small risk gave broadcasts a sense of immediacy. Events seemed to be taking place now, not yesterday, and not after careful editing. News from abroad strengthened this impression during 1938. Europe was moving closer to war. Nazi Germany had rearmed, occupied the Rhineland, and absorbed Austria in March. During the Austrian crisis, CBS organised a pioneering broadcast that connected correspondents and journalists in several European capitals through shortwave radio. Edward R. Murrow reported from Vienna, while William Shirer helped arrange contributions from London, Berlin, Paris, and Rome. American listeners heard distant voices describing a major international event with unusual speed and immediacy. Radio demonstrated that it could carry the sound of a crisis across an ocean. In September, only a month before the War of the Worlds broadcast, the Munich crisis again filled the air with urgent reports. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France negotiated with Germany, while the possibility of a European war appeared frighteningly real. Americans heard bulletins, commentary, speeches, and updates arriving at irregular hours. The voices sometimes sounded strained because the situation was changing quickly. Listeners became accustomed to scheduled entertainment being interrupted by reports from places whose names had suddenly become important. A dance orchestra might stop, and an announcer would describe negotiations in Europe. The programme would return, only to be interrupted again when new information arrived. That pattern was almost exactly what the Mercury Theatre would imitate on October 30th. The audience therefore brought recent experience to the fictional broadcast. When music was interrupted by an announcement from an observatory, the form did not sound unusual. When the programme returned to music after the bulletin, that also sounded correct. Real broadcasters frequently resumed regular programming when there was nothing new to report. When another bulletin followed, listeners had already learned what repeated interruptions meant. The situation was developing. Radio networks made these shared experiences possible on a national scale. NBC had begun network operations in 1926, and CBS followed soon afterward. By the end of 1938, CBS and NBC together operated networks composed of hundreds of affiliated stations. A program originating in New York could be sent through telephone lines to stations in cities and towns across the country, where local transmitters carried it into nearby homes. Mutual provided another growing network. The system allowed sponsors, performers, politicians, and reporters to address a national audience at the same moment. For the first time, families separated by thousands of miles could laugh at the same joke while it was being performed. A child in New Jersey and a child in California could hear the same adventure program on the same evening. Election results, championship fights, presidential addresses, and breaking news became collective events. People discussed them at work and school the next day because they knew others had heard them too. This shared schedule made the radio feel dependable. Favourite programmes began at regular times, sponsors paid for them, networks protected their reputations, announcers spoke with practiced clarity, stations identified themselves and followed federal rules. The Federal Radio Commission, replaced by the Federal Communications Commission in 1934, licensed stations and attempted to reduce interference and disorder on the airwaves. To the ordinary listener, the result sounded organised and official. The chaotic experimental medium of the early 1920s had become a professional industry. The announcer played an important role in creating this impression. Radio voices were trained to be understandable through imperfect speakers and unreliable reception. Words were pronounced clearly. Sentences were controlled. Even advertisements were delivered with confidence. The announcer rarely sounded unsure unless the programme required uncertainty. His task was to guide the listener through the schedule and make every transition seem orderly. News announcers adopted an especially serious style. They spoke with authority because hesitation could suggest that the information had not been confirmed. Place names, official titles, and numbers were delivered carefully. When correspondents reported from distant locations, studio announcers introduced them in ways that established credibility. The network wanted the audience to know who was speaking and why that person should be trusted. Families learned these conventions without consciously studying them. They knew the difference between a comedian's voice and a news announcer's voice. They recognized the sound of a commercial. They understood that orchestral music might be used to fill time before another segment. They knew that a reporter at the scene of an event might be interrupted by static or technical trouble. All of these familiar details would be assembled inside the Mercury Theatre studio and used to describe something that had never happened. Trust did not mean complete innocence. Americans complained about radio advertising, disliked certain programs, accused networks of political bias, and understood that actors were pretending. Listeners were capable of skepticism. They knew that dramas use sound effects, and that announcers read prepared material. The same audience that trusted Roosevelt to explain a bank crisis could laugh at a fictional detective solving a crime. The danger arose when the normal boundaries between those forms became difficult to hear. Traditional radio drama usually announced itself quickly. Music established the mood. A narrator introduced characters. Actors entered scenes in an orderly manner. The audience understood that it was listening to a play. The Mercury Theatre had used this approach in earlier productions of literary works. Its audience was relatively small, but respected the programme's serious adaptations. The War of the Worlds would begin with a clear introduction, but after that introduction it would behave differently. It would borrow the voice of news, the interruptions of a crisis, the authority of experts, the uncertainty of field reporting, and the technical failures of live broadcasting. For someone tuning in late, the expected signs of theatre would be missing. There was one more reason the voice in the living room carried such power. Radio often reached people when they were physically safe and emotionally unguarded. They listened at home, surrounded by family, furniture, familiar smells, and ordinary routines. News did not arrive while they stood in a public square prepared to evaluate a speech. It arrived while someone knitted, read the newspaper, washed dishes, or helped a child with homework. The medium entered the private room where people expected to relax. That closeness could be comforting. A lonely person heard company. A frightened person heard reassurance. A family with little money received an evening of entertainment. But the same closeness could make alarming information feel intensely personal. A newspaper headline remained on the page. A radio voice seemed present in the room, telling you that danger was moving toward your house. By October 1938, Americans had spent years learning that the radio could be trusted to tell them when something important had happened. It had reported floods, storms, political crises, elections, fires, kidnappings, and events overseas. It had carried the president's voice during national uncertainty. It had described games and ceremonies in real time. It had interrupted entertainment when the world demanded attention. That Sunday evening, families approached the radio with all of that experience already in place. They did not need to be taught how to interpret a bulletin. They knew what an interruption meant. They knew what a field reporter sounded like. They knew that distant events could suddenly become national emergencies. They knew that a calm evening could be broken by a serious voice. Inside a New York studio, Orson Welles and the members of the Mercury Theatre were preparing to use every one of those expectations. They had a difficult novel, an unfinished-feeling script, a modest audience, and less than an hour to convince listeners that machines from another planet were crossing New Jersey. At first, even the actors were not convinced that the idea would work. Then they began changing the way the story sounded. Before the Martians landed in New Jersey, before a reporter began shouting into a microphone from a farm field, and before frightened listeners reached for telephones, there was a young man in New York trying to prevent his weekly radio program from becoming dull. That is the part of the story that is easy to lose beneath everything that happened afterward. The most famous fictional emergency in broadcasting history did not begin as an elaborate plan to terrify the United States. It began as a deadline. A group of tired actors needed another hour of material for Sunday night. The script was giving everyone trouble, and Orson Welles had several other problems competing for his attention. By October 1938, Welles was only 23 years old, although his voice made him sound considerably older. Photographs show a round-faced young man with dark hair, heavy eyebrows, and the expression of someone who had already decided that a normal amount of work was not enough. He acted, directed, produced, rewrote scripts, designed stage effects, and moved between theatres and radio studios at a pace that exhausted people who were merely watching him. He had not yet made Citizen Kane. Hollywood had not yet handed him the kind of creative freedom that would turn him into one of the most discussed filmmakers in America. At this point, he was known mainly as the remarkable young director who had made New York theatre audiences pay attention. Welles had worked with producer John Houseman in the Federal Theatre Project, a government-supported program that employed theatre workers during the Great Depression. Their productions included an adaptation of Macbeth, performed by an African-American cast and set in a Caribbean-inspired world, a visually striking Dr. Faustus, and Mark Blitzstein's political musical, The Cradle Will Rock. When government officials prevented that musical from opening in its planned theatre in June 1937, Welles, Houseman, Blitzstein, and much of the audience moved to another building. Union restrictions prevented the actors from performing normally on stage, so Blitzstein played the score at a piano while performers stood up from seats around the theatre and sang their roles from the audience. It was chaotic, defiant, and exactly the sort of solution Welles enjoyed. Soon afterward, he and Houseman formed their own company, the Mercury Theatre. The Mercury Theatre opened its first season with Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, staged in modern clothing and shaped to remind audiences of the fascist movements rising in Europe. There were few elaborate decorations, The lighting was severe. The actors wore uniforms that suggested contemporary dictatorships rather than ancient Rome. Wells played Brutus and directed the production, while Houseman handled much of the practical work that kept the company functioning. The show became a sensation and ran for months. Other productions followed, and by the spring of 1938, Wells had become famous enough to appear on the cover of Time magazine. The article treated him as a theatrical wonder, a young man who seemed capable of doing almost everything, and who had no particular interest in doing anything quietly. It is tempting to picture a genius at this stage as someone protected from ordinary concerns, sitting alone in a room while everyone else waits for the next brilliant idea. The Mercury Theatre did not operate that way. It was a working company with actors to pay, buildings to rent, rehearsals to arrange, and productions that could lose money. Houseman worried about budgets and schedules. Actors moved between theatrical work and radio jobs because radio paid quickly. Wells was often late, distracted, or occupied with several productions at once. His imagination was enormous, but so was the amount of unfinished business surrounding him. Radio had already become an important part of his career. He had appeared on The March of Time, a popular series that dramatized current events using actors, narrators, and sound effects. The program recreated political speeches, disasters, court cases, and international developments in a fast-moving style that sounded partly like journalism and partly like theatre. Wells also performed for the experimental Columbia Workshop and became the voice of Lamont Cranston in The Shadow, opening episodes with the famous question about who knew what evil lurked in the hearts of men. These jobs taught him how much could be accomplished with nothing more than a microphone, music, careful timing, and a listener's imagination. The stage allowed Wells to control what the audience saw. He could use costumes, lights, movement, scenery, and the arrangement of bodies across a room. Radio removed all of that. There was no curtain to raise, no face for the audience to study, and no machine that needed to look convincing. A wooden door could be represented by a sound effects worker opening a smaller studio door. A battlefield could be created with recorded explosions and several actors shouting at different distances from the microphone. A man could become elderly, powerful, frightened, or exhausted by changing the way he breathed between sentences. Wells understood that radio should not simply copy the theatre. A stage play placed in front of microphones often sounded flat because the audience could not see the physical action that gave the dialogue meaning. Radio needed its own structure. It needed narration, sound, silence, and changes in vocal distance. A person whispering close to the microphone could sound as if he were speaking directly into the listener's ear. Another actor standing farther away might seem to be across a field or at the end of a corridor. A sudden silence could describe destruction more effectively than a long speech. CBS offered Wells and the Mercury Company a weekly dramatic series in the summer of 1938. The network promoted the program as an attempt to bring important literature to the radio, and initially called it First Person Singular. The first production, Dracula, used diary entries and shifting voices to tell the story through the experiences of its characters. Later broadcasts adapted Treasure Island, A Tale of Two Cities, The 39 Steps, Julius Caesar, and other familiar works. The name eventually became the Mercury Theatre on the air. Wells and his company had considerable freedom to choose material and experiment with the form, but the program remained low budget and had no commercial sponsor. That lack of a sponsor offered freedom, but it also revealed a problem. Sponsors paid for the largest radio programs and expected large audiences in return. The Mercury Theatre had prestige, but prestige did not guarantee that millions of people would listen. On Sunday evenings at 8 o'clock, the company competed with one of the most popular programs in the country, the Chase and Sanborn Hour, starring ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his wooden dummy Charlie McCarthy. Bergen's show had comedy, music, guests, and an audience that returned every week. The Mercury Theatre offered dense literary adaptations performed by serious actors. It was an admirable program, But admiration is not always the same thing as ratings. By the end of October, the series had been broadcasting for 17 weeks. It had developed a small, loyal audience, but it had not defeated Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, and no sponsor had appeared to rescue it. The Mercury Theatre needed attention. Wells wanted the Halloween programme to sound different from what the company had done before. He became interested in presenting a crisis as if it were happening at that moment, using radio's own news techniques rather than the recognisable structure of a conventional play. He discussed the idea with John Houseman and Paul Stewart, an experienced radio actor who helped direct the broadcasts. They considered several science fiction stories before choosing H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. The choice looked promising in theory. H.G. Wells's novel already contained destruction, military defeat, mass movement, and creatures from another planet. Published at the end of the 19th century, it described Martians arriving in southern England, emerging from metal cylinders and using heat rays and poisonous black smoke against human beings. The British military, despite all its confidence, proved almost helpless against the invaders. The Martians continued until they were killed not by soldiers, but by earthly microorganisms against which their bodies had no defence. The original story also contained a serious argument beneath its science fiction. Britain had spent generations using superior weapons and industrial power to control people in other parts of the world. Wells asked his readers to imagine what it would feel like if a more advanced power treated Britain with the same indifference. That meaning mattered in the novel, but it presented a difficulty for a 1-hour American radio show. Much of the book followed a narrator moving through the English countryside over several days. He observed ruins, refugees, abandoned roads, destroyed towns, and the slow collapse of society. Radio needed the invasion to move much faster. Houseman gave the adaptation to Howard Koch, a young writer who had recently joined the programme. Koch would later work in Hollywood and share an Academy Award for the screenplay of Casablanca. But in October 1938, he was facing a difficult assignment with very little time. He had to read the novel, move the action from England to the United States, reduce the story to less than an hour, and present much of it through breaking news bulletins. He was not immediately excited. He regarded the novel as dated, and the idea of Martians invading Earth seemed more suitable for children's comic strips than a serious Mercury Theatre broadcast. This is where the legend and the reality begin to separate. The legend suggests a group of clever men sitting around a table, calmly designing the perfect deception. In reality, the people preparing the show were worried that the material would bore the audience. They were not asking how to make Americans run into the streets. They were asking how to keep listeners from turning the dial. Koch began translating the story into American geography. England became New Jersey and New York. The first cylinder would fall near Princeton. Observatories would study explosions on Mars. Reporters would travel to the landing site. Military units would be sent into the area. The advancing Martians would threaten the largest city in the country. The original location chosen for the landing was not Grover's Mill. According to later accounts, Koch placed a pencil over a map of New Jersey and selected the small community almost by chance. Grover's Mill was a rural place near Princeton, surrounded by farms and roads that most national listeners had never heard of. That obscurity helped. A famous city might have seemed theatrical. A small, specific place sounded like somewhere a news reporter might actually be sent after a strange object fell into a field. The script imitated the sequence of a real developing story. It would begin with an ordinary program of dance music. An announcer would interrupt with a bulletin about unusual activity on Mars. The music would return. Another report would follow. A scientific expert would be interviewed. News would arrive that an object had fallen in New Jersey. A field reporter would describe the scene. Each interruption would add information while maintaining the impression that the network was responding to events it had not expected. Koch produced a draft, but the company remained dissatisfied. Some passages sounded too much like traditional drama. Others explained the passage of time in ways that weakened the impression of a live event. Houseman, Koch, Stewart, and other members of the team continued revising. References suggesting that the invasion had unfolded over several days were removed. The fictional events began to feel as though they were occurring at the same speed as the broadcast. The change created an absurd timeline in which Martians could land, destroy military forces, and reach New York within roughly 40 minutes, but listeners carried forward by the bulletins might not stop to calculate that. The revisions also created a long stretch, without an unmistakable reminder that the audience was hearing a play. The program would announce itself clearly at the beginning, but a person tuning in after that introduction could hear bulletin after bulletin without encountering the usual station identification at the half hour. No one appears to have fully considered what this would mean for late listeners. To the writers and actors, the fictional frame was obvious, because they had been living inside the script all week. They knew there were no Martians. They knew every reporter was an actor. They knew the orchestra did not exist in a hotel ballroom. It was difficult for them to imagine hearing the program without that knowledge. CBS reviewed the script before broadcast. Lawyers requested changes to some names and institutions, partly to avoid presenting real organizations in ways that might cause legal trouble. The network did not forbid the basic news bulletin structure. The program identified itself as the War of the Worlds at the beginning, and there was no reason to assume that listeners would ignore or miss that announcement. The actors then began shaping the script into something that sounded human. Radio dialogue could not merely be correct. It had to sound like speech produced under pressure. A reporter witnessing something impossible should not describe it with the polished confidence of a narrator reading a novel. He should hesitate. He should search for comparisons. He should struggle to explain what his eyes were seeing. Frank Reddick was cast as Carl Phillips, the reporter sent to Grover's Mill. Reddick had experience on the march of time, where actors regularly imitated real people and recreated recent news. To prepare for the Martian landing, he reportedly listened repeatedly to Herbert Morrison's recording of the Hindenburg disaster. Morrison had been describing the German airship's arrival in New Jersey in May 1937 when it caught fire. His professional delivery collapsed as he watched people die. He struggled to continue speaking while shock entered his voice. Reddick studied that change, not to make fun of Morrison, but to understand how a trained announcer might sound when an orderly report became a catastrophe. The sound effects department faced its own problems. A Martian machine had no recognized sound. Listeners knew what a train, automobile, rifle or airplane sounded like, but no one could tell the crew that an alien cylinder was opening incorrectly. Ora Nichols, the head of sound effects at the New York CBS station, and her team had to build noises for machinery that did not exist. Metal lids, microphones, electrical equipment, and studio devices could be combined until the result suggested something heavy, mechanical, and unfamiliar. Wells later praised Nichols for the work she'd done. Music was handled by Bernard Herrmann, the Mercury Theatre's young conductor. Herrmann would later compose famous film scores, including the music for Citizen Kane and Psycho. But in 1938 he was working with radio orchestras and learning how sound could guide an audience without calling attention to itself. For the War of the Worlds, music needed to play two different roles. It introduced the Mercury Theatre as a dramatic program, but it also became the fictional dance music of Ramon Raquello and his orchestra. The hotel music had to sound ordinary enough that an interruption would feel like an interruption rather than a planned dramatic entrance. The orchestra deliberately played in a way that resembled a modest hotel band heard over a remote radio connection. The music was not meant to be impressive. It was meant to be believable. The pauses between bulletins mattered as much as the tunes. If the reports came too quickly at the beginning, listeners would recognize the pattern as theatrical. Wells decided that the program needed to move slowly at first. Music would continue for uncomfortable lengths of time. The announcer would return calmly. Each report would appear to be a small addition to a story that had not yet become dangerous. Houseman objected to some of this pacing. The opening risked becoming tedious, which was exactly the problem they had been trying to avoid. Wells insisted. He believed that the audience needed to experience normal broadcasting before the crisis accelerated. Once the cylinder opened, the reports could come faster, voices could become less controlled, and the world inside the radio could collapse almost without warning. Wells arrived at CBS Studio 1 on the afternoon of October 30th for the final rehearsals. Members of the company later remembered these sessions as frantic. Wells often became most active when time was nearly gone. He criticised material, demanded cuts, added dialogue, adjusted performances, and forced everyone to respond while the broadcast clock continued moving toward 8 o'clock. What looked like chaos from outside was part of his working method. The fixed airtime gave him a deadline he could not charm, postpone, or ignore. He slowed the opening even further. He worked on the timing of the bulletins. He restored a government speech that had been removed from the script, changing the speaker from the Secretary of War to the Secretary of the Interior. Kenneth Delmar, the actor assigned to the role, could imitate Franklin Roosevelt's voice with unusual accuracy. Networks generally discouraged unauthorized impersonations of the president because listeners might become confused. The character was not identified as Roosevelt, but the rhythm and tone were close enough to make the fictional statement sound more official. No single choice created the effect of the finished broadcast. Howard Koch provided the adapted script. Houseman helped structure and revise it. Paul Stewart worked with the actors and production. Frank Redick shaped the field reporter's fear. Ora Nichols and the sound crew gave the Martian machinery a physical presence. Bernard Herrmann and the musicians created the calm hotel broadcast that would be repeatedly interrupted. The actors offered suggestions and adjusted their delivery. Wells controlled the pace, demanded changes, performed Professor Pearson, and drove the production through its final hours. That collaboration matters because the broadcast is often described as though Wells alone sat before a microphone and hypnotized the country. His name dominated the program and his talent shaped it, but radio required many people working out of sight. A sound cue arriving 2 seconds late could weaken a scene. An actor sounding too theatrical could expose the illusion. Music ending too neatly could remind listeners that everything had been rehearsed. The program depended on dozens of small decisions made by people who expected to produce a strong Halloween show and then go home. Some members of the company still believed the result would fail. One actor reportedly warned a radio critic that the program was poor and likely to bore him. A technician gave Wells a similarly discouraging report before the final rehearsal. The subject seemed ridiculous. The script had been assembled quickly. The Mercury Theatre was competing with the most popular show on Sunday radio. Nothing suggested that newspapers would be discussing the production the following morning. That is the important point to hold on to as the hour approaches. The Mercury Theatre wanted realism. Wells wanted the audience to feel that the events were immediate rather than safely contained inside a conventional play. The actors wanted their reactions to sound natural. The sound crew wanted the machines to seem convincing. But there is a difference between trying to absorb an audience and planning to send frightened people toward police stations and highways. In later years, Wells sometimes suggested that the company had hoped to teach listeners not to believe everything they heard on the radio. That version made him sound more calculating and turned the broadcast into a deliberate social experiment. His collaborators did not support it. Their memories, along with surviving drafts, suggest that the production became dangerous almost by accident. They were working hard to keep an unlikely story from sounding foolish. Every improvement removed a little distance between drama and news, until some listeners could no longer hear where one ended and the other began. By early evening, the actors were standing near their microphones with scripts in hand. The orchestra was ready. Sound effects equipment waited for cues. Studio employees watched the clock. Outside, New York continued through an ordinary Sunday night. Families finished supper, children prepared for bed, and radios were tuned to comedy, music, sermons, and drama. At 8 o'clock, the CBS announcer clearly identified Orson Welles, the Mercury Theatre on the air, and The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Anyone listening carefully from the first sentence knew that a play was beginning. Wells then delivered an opening narration that placed the story near the end of October 1938. A weather report followed. The network appeared to move away from drama and into an evening of routine dance music from a hotel in New York. The orchestra began playing. A few minutes later, listeners turning away from Charlie McCarthy arrived on the CBS frequency. They had missed the title. They had missed Wells's introduction. They heard music, an announcer, and then the words that regular programming was being interrupted. The Mercury Theatre had finished rehearsing. Now the invasion could begin. At exactly 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday, October the 30th, 1938, the Columbia Broadcasting System introduced Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre on the air in an adaptation of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. The announcement was direct and unmistakable. The title of the novel was spoken. The name of the dramatic company was given. Anyone sitting beside the radio from the first second had been told that a performance was about to begin. Then Orson Welles spoke. His opening came from the beginning of H.G. Wells's novel, adjusted for the American audience and brought forward to the year 1938. In his low, controlled voice, Wells described intelligent beings observing the Earth from across space, while human beings continued with their ordinary concerns. He presented humanity as confident in its control of the planet, unaware that another intelligence had begun preparing against it. The language was serious and clearly theatrical, the kind of introduction expected from the Mercury Theatre's weekly adaptations of famous books. The opening even mentioned the date, October 30th, and imagined millions of people listening to radios across the country. It referred to improving business conditions, the easing of the recent war scare, and the return of some men to work. These references placed the fictional story inside the world that listeners knew. The country was not introduced as some distant future civilization. It was America that evening, with the same economy, the same international anxieties, and the same families sitting around the same radios. A weather report followed. There was nothing dramatic about it. Temperatures were given. A disturbance over Nova Scotia was mentioned. Rain and wind were forecast for parts of the northeastern United States. The report sounded like the practical information that stations delivered every day. Then the announcer transferred the audience to the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel in New York, where Ramon Raquello and his orchestra were supposedly performing an evening of dance music. The orchestra began a tango. This was the first important trick, although the word trick makes it sound more mischievous than the production team probably understood it to be. The Mercury Theatre did not immediately continue with recognisable dramatic scenes. Instead, it imitated a routine remote broadcast from a hotel ballroom. Radio networks regularly carried dance bands from restaurants, hotels, and nightclubs. The music might sound slightly distant because the fictional announcer was not supposed to be sitting in the main CBS studio. Nothing suggested that the world was about to end. It sounded like the sort of music a listener might allow to play in the background while reading, sewing, or finishing the dishes. The orchestra played for only a short time before an announcer interrupted. His voice remained calm. A news service had received a report from Professor Farrell at the Mount Jennings Observatory near Chicago. Several explosions of bright gas had been observed on Mars. The gas appeared to be moving toward the Earth at enormous speed. Professor Richard Pearson of Princeton had confirmed the observations and compared the phenomenon to a blue flame fired from a gun. That was all. The announcer returned the audience to Ramon Raquello and his orchestra. The first bulletin did not say that Martians existed. It did not report an invasion. It did not even claim that an object had left Mars. Astronomers had noticed unusual activity on a distant planet, and scientists were investigating it. The information was strange enough to hold attention, but not alarming enough to make an ordinary listener run from the house. That restraint gave the story room to grow. Had Wells begun with explosions and screaming crowds, most listeners would have recognised the production as a dramatic fantasy. Instead, the broadcast allowed uncertainty to develop in small steps. The announcer gave one fact, then stepped away. The music continued as though the network itself was waiting for more information. Another announcement soon interrupted the orchestra. Government meteorological officials had asked major observatories to watch Mars for further disturbances. CBS had arranged an interview with Professor Pearson at Princeton. Once again, the dance music returned while the connection was supposedly prepared. The pauses mattered. Wells had deliberately slowed the early portion during rehearsal, because he believed the later acceleration would feel more convincing if the evening began quietly. The musical stretches risked boring the audience, but they also copied the pace of real developing news, in which broadcasters often had to return to scheduled programming, while reporters travelled, telephone connections were arranged, or officials decided what they could confirm. The network then transferred the audience to Princeton Observatory. Carl Phillips, the fictional reporter played by Frank Reddick, described a dark, semicircular room, a large telescope, the movement of its clockwork, and stars visible through an opening in the ceiling. His description created an entire scientific institution, using only his voice and a few carefully chosen sounds. Professor Pearson, played by Wells, remained calm and slightly impatient. Mars appeared normal through the telescope. The lines visible on its surface were not canals, he explained, despite popular speculation about an inhabited planet. When Phillips asked whether intelligent life existed there, Pearson placed the chances against it at 1,000 to 1. The repeated gas eruptions remained unexplained, but the planet was roughly 40 million miles away, a distance that Phillips treated as reassuring. This exchange served several purposes at once. It established Pearson as a serious scientist rather than an excitable believer in Martians. It gave the audience an expert whose later alarm would carry more weight, because he had initially dismissed the danger. It also allowed Phillips to behave like a normal radio reporter, asking basic questions for listeners who knew little about astronomy. A message arrived during the interview. A seismograph in New York had registered a powerful shock within 20 miles of Princeton. Pearson suggested that a large meteorite had probably fallen and that its timing was a coincidence. A search could be conducted after daylight. The interview ended and the broadcast returned to the studio. A new bulletin immediately removed the comfort Pearson had tried to provide. Canadian astronomers had also observed explosions on Mars. More importantly, a large flaming object had fallen on a farm near Grover's Mill, New Jersey, about 22 miles from Trenton. The flash had reportedly been visible across a wide area, and the sound of the impact had been heard miles away. Carl Phillips and Professor Pearson were being sent to investigate. While they travelled, the audience was offered another orchestra, this one supposedly playing from a hotel in Brooklyn. By now, a listener who had arrived late might have no reason to suspect a play. That late arrival was common. Many Americans had begun the hour listening to Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy on NBC. When that program shifted into a musical section, some people turned the dial looking for something else. They missed the Mercury Theatre announcement and Wells's opening narration. What they found on CBS was dance music interrupted by scientific reports about Mars and a falling object in New Jersey. Surveys conducted after the broadcast suggested that a large portion of those who heard the program had tuned in after it began. The Brooklyn Orchestra played for approximately 20 seconds before the network transferred listeners to Grover's Mill. The sound changed at once. Instead of controlled studio quiet, the audience heard a crowd and police sirens. Carl Phillips announced that he and Pearson had travelled the 11 miles from Princeton in 10 minutes. The claim was unlikely on the roads of 1938, especially with crowds converging on the farm, but the speed helped the program maintain its live momentum. Phillips sounded uncertain about where to begin. In front of him was a large pit and an object partly buried in the ground. Broken pieces of a tree were scattered nearby. The supposed meteorite did not resemble any meteorite he had seen. It was a metal cylinder approximately 30 yards across, smooth, yellowish white, and unlike anything Professor Pearson could identify. Hundreds of people were gathering. Cars filled a nearby field. Their headlights illuminated the pit. Police officers tried to hold spectators back, but people continued moving closer. That detail was completely believable. An unusual object falling onto a farm near a populated area would draw curious neighbours, reporters, officials, and anyone with an automobile. There was still no military invasion. There was only a local crowd surrounding something they did not understand. Phillips interviewed Mr. Wilmoth, the farmer on whose property the cylinder had landed. Wilmoth explained that he had been listening to the radio and beginning to doze when he heard a hissing noise. He looked outside, saw a green streak, and felt the impact throw him from his chair. His manner was ordinary, slow, and slightly awkward. He did not sound like a polished actor delivering information. Phillips repeatedly asked him to move closer to the microphone and answer more directly. That small piece of comedy made the scene more convincing. In a badly designed drama, every witness speaks clearly and provides exactly the information the story requires. Real radio interviews were often untidy. People stood too far from the microphone, misunderstood questions, repeated themselves, or tried to continue after the reporter had received enough. Mr. Wilmoth behaved like a farmer surprised to find a radio network in his field. After the interview, Phillips returned his attention to the cylinder. A faint humming had begun inside it. He asked the audience to listen. The microphone was carried closer until it stood roughly 25 feet from the object. A scraping sound followed. Professor Pearson first suggested that the noise might come from the metal cooling unevenly, then admitted that the casing appeared to be made from material not found on Earth. The end of the cylinder began rotating. Crowd voices rose behind the reporter. Someone suggested that men might be trapped inside. Police ordered spectators to stand back. The metal lid turned like a giant screw until it fell free with a heavy crash. Phillips continued speaking because that was his job, although his voice had begun to lose its professional steadiness. Something appeared in the opening. He first noticed two glowing discs that might have been eyes. Then several long shapes moved from the darkness like grey snakes. The creature's body was large, heavy, and shining. Phillips compared it to wet leather. He described black eyes, a V-shaped mouth, moving lips, and saliva. The being seemed to struggle under the force of Earth's gravity. The description worked because it was incomplete. Phillips repeatedly admitted that he could not find the right words. A reporter who instantly produced an elegant description of a Martian would sound as though he had prepared it. Phillips sounded like a man trying to keep talking while every familiar category failed him. The crowd backed away. For a brief moment the network returned to piano music. Then the announcer transferred the audience back to Grover's Mill. Phillips was now positioned behind a stone wall bordering the Wilmoth garden. The change suggested that enough time had passed for him to pull the microphone away from the pit and find some protection. He told listeners that he would continue for as long as he could see and speak. State police had formed a line near the cylinder. A police captain and 2 officers walked forward carrying a white flag. Professor Pearson had apparently advised them, although no one knew whether the creatures understood the meaning of a truce. A shape rose from the pit. Phillips saw a small beam reflected against a mirror. A flame shot toward the advancing men. They caught fire immediately. Screams filled the broadcast. The beam swept across the field, striking police officers, cars, and nearby trees. The reporter tried to continue describing it while people ran around him. Then his voice stopped. The signal from Grover's Mill disappeared. The New York announcer returned, but he did not immediately explain what had happened. He stated that the field transmission had been interrupted and that the network was attempting to restore contact. Piano music filled the gap. That music may have been more frightening than another explosion. A listener had just heard a reporter describe people burning alive, followed by screams and a dead connection. Then the network offered a quiet piano interlude because it supposedly had no further information. Real broadcasting often used music when a connection failed. The program had moved beyond describing a fictional emergency and begun imitating the technical confusion surrounding one. A bulletin eventually reported that at least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, were dead in the field near Grover's Mill. The bodies were burned beyond recognition. Brigadier General Montgomery Smith of the New Jersey militia announced that troops were being mobilized and that residents should remain calm. More information followed. The creatures had withdrawn into the pit. Fire departments from Mercer County were attempting to control flames spreading through the countryside. Professor Pearson had survived and established an observation point at a nearby farmhouse. Through a filtered telephone connection, he described the weapon as a heat ray, possibly produced by intense energy projected through a polished mirror. Then the announcer reported that Carl Phillips's burned body had been identified. The statement was delivered without ceremony. A voice the audience had been following only minutes earlier was now dead. This was another feature borrowed from news. The reporter did not return to perform a final scene. His death became a short bulletin among military updates, Red Cross movements, and reports from state police. CBS's fictional vice president of operations then announced that the network was turning its facilities over to the state militia, because radio had a responsibility to serve the public during the emergency. This was an especially effective detail. The broadcast did not merely claim that officials were responding. It presented the radio network itself as part of the national response, sacrificing entertainment so military authorities could communicate with the public. Captain Lansing of the Signal Corps spoke from a militia position overlooking the cylinder. He assured listeners that the situation was under control. 8 battalions of infantry, numbering roughly 7,000 men, surrounded the pit. Searchlights illuminated the area. The creatures appeared unwilling to emerge and, in Lansing's opinion, could not survive concentrated machine gun fire. His confidence lasted only moments. A metal structure began rising from the cylinder. It unfolded upward on long legs until it stood above the trees. The broadcast cut away from Lansing before the audience heard a complete account of what followed. The announcer then gave the conclusion in the language of military disaster. A single Martian fighting machine had defeated the force around Grover's Mill. Of the approximately 7,000 soldiers, only 120 were known to have survived. The machine controlled central New Jersey. Railroad service had been disrupted. Highways were crowded with people fleeing. Communication lines were down, and martial law had been declared across New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. The invasion had expanded from one farm to an entire region in less time than many families needed to finish washing the supper dishes. A government official was brought on from Washington. He was identified as the Secretary of the Interior, but actor Kenny Delmar delivered the speech in a manner resembling Franklin Roosevelt. The resemblance was close enough to suggest presidential authority without directly naming the president. The official acknowledged the seriousness of the situation, called for calm, expressed confidence in the military, and urged Americans to continue performing their duties. For listeners accustomed to Roosevelt's fireside chats, the voice carried familiar weight. The fictional government was no longer treating the event as a local accident. It was speaking to the whole country about national unity and the preservation of human control over the earth. The bulletins accelerated after that. Additional explosions continued on Mars. Another cylinder had landed in the Great Swamp south of Morristown. 3 Martian machines were moving north through New Jersey. Bridges, railway tracks, power lines, and communication systems were being destroyed. Army bombers took off to intercept them. Artillery units positioned in the Watchung Mountains prepared to fire. The audience was taken directly to an artillery battery. Officers calculated the range. Guns fired. Observers corrected the aim. One shell struck the leg of a Martian machine, and for a moment the soldiers appeared capable of stopping it. Then black smoke emerged. The gas remained low to the ground and moved rapidly toward the battery. Soldiers put on masks, commands became muffled. The men continued calling out range and elevation while coughing. Their voices weakened until the transmission ended beneath the sound of choking. The network immediately switched to Lieutenant Vogt, commanding 8 bombers over New Jersey. He described 6 Martian machines moving toward New York. 1 had been damaged. The others crossed the Passaic River and the marshes, one stepping over the Pulaski Skyway. The bombers approached in formation. A green flash struck the aircraft. Their engines failed before the bombs could be released. Vogt decided to dive directly into one of the machines. His final countdown ended in the sound of the aircraft going down. A radio operator then confirmed that all 8 bombers had crashed, although 1 Martian machine had been destroyed. Newark reported poisonous smoke entering the city. Gas masks were useless. Residents were told to move toward open ground and avoid crowded routes. Radio operators called one another and received no answer. Bells began ringing in New York. The final announcer of this portion stood on the roof of the broadcasting building. He told the audience that millions were trying to evacuate the city. Roads north were crowded. Bridges to Long Island were blocked. The Army and Air Force had been destroyed. Religious services were taking place below, while boats overloaded with refugees moved into the harbour. Then the machines appeared above the Palisades. One crossed the Hudson River as easily as a person stepping through shallow water. Other cylinders were reportedly falling near Buffalo, Chicago, and St. Louis. The invasion was no longer confined to New Jersey. From the rooftop, the announcer described 5 machines entering New York. Their metal bodies rose to the height of the buildings. Black smoke spread across the city. Crowds moved toward the East River. The gas crossed Times Square, 6th Avenue, and 5th Avenue. The announcer measured its distance until it reached the roof. His body fell beside the microphone. A lone radio operator continued sending a call into the silence, asking whether anyone remained on the air. Only then, roughly 40 minutes into the program, did CBS clearly announce again that listeners were hearing Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre's dramatization of The War of the Worlds. The regular identification that would normally have come at the half hour had been delayed by about 10 minutes to preserve the action. For people who had tuned in late, the clarification arrived after New Jersey had been destroyed, the army defeated, and New York covered in poisonous smoke. Inside the studio, the actors had completed the most dangerous portion of the performance. Outside it, switchboards were filling. Police officers, newspaper clerks, radio employees, and telephone operators were beginning to realize that some listeners had not heard a Halloween drama. They had heard instructions to survive. The first people to carry the Martian invasion beyond the radio studio were not reporters, soldiers, or government officials. They were listeners reaching for telephones. Within minutes of the first reports from Grover's Mill, calls began arriving at police stations, newspaper offices, radio networks, hospitals, fire departments, and the homes of relatives who happened to live in New Jersey. Some callers wanted confirmation, others wanted instructions. A few had already accepted the broadcast as real and were trying to warn anyone who had not heard it. Inside those homes, the decision to make a telephone call was often made quickly. A father listened to the report of the heat ray and turned toward the telephone. A woman heard that poisonous gas was spreading through Newark and tried to reach her husband. Someone living in Pennsylvania remembered relatives in Trenton. A family in New York heard that the bridges were crowded and wanted to know whether they should leave before the roads became impossible. The telephone seemed like the natural place to turn because it offered a second human voice. The radio had delivered the danger, but a police officer, newspaper editor, or telephone operator might be able to explain it. The difficulty was that many of the people receiving the calls had no explanation ready. A desk sergeant answering the telephone at a local police station had probably not been listening to the Mercury Theatre. He might have been completing paperwork, speaking with another officer, or handling an ordinary Sunday evening complaint. Then a caller asked whether Martians had landed nearby. At first, the question must have sounded like a joke. Another call arrived, then another. People reported a meteorite near Princeton. They asked whether roads were open. They wanted to know if the state militia had been mobilized. Some said they had heard that gas was moving toward their neighborhood. Others asked whether New York had been destroyed. Police officers turned on radios, called neighboring departments, contacted newspapers, and tried to determine what was happening. In Trenton, the capital of New Jersey, the city manager later reported that police communication lines became overwhelmed. Around 2,000 calls were said to have reached police headquarters during a period of roughly 2 hours. The callers were not all reporting strange objects in the sky. Many simply wanted information, but the effect on the telephone system was the same. Lines needed for normal police business were occupied by frightened or confused residents. That created a dangerous circle. People called the police because they could not verify the radio report. The police, receiving hundreds of calls about the same event, began wondering whether there might be something to verify. A caller who heard hesitation in an officer's voice could interpret it as proof that officials were hiding bad news. An officer who heard panic in the voice of a caller might assume that the person had seen something directly rather than merely heard the broadcast. The rumour moved forward with each conversation. The original programme had been specific. A cylinder had fallen near Grover's Mill. Martians had emerged. Military forces had been defeated. Black smoke was spreading. But once the story passed from one person to another, those details changed. The object was no longer near Grover's Mill. It had landed outside town, on the next road, near a reservoir, beside a railway, or somewhere between the caller's home and the nearest city. Some people heard that New Jersey was being bombed. Others understood that Germans had attacked. A few believed the poisonous gas was connected to a chemical accident rather than an invasion from Mars. This confusion made sense in 1938. Europe had spent much of the year moving toward war. American newspapers had printed photographs of soldiers, bombers, gas masks, and frightened civilians. Only weeks earlier, families had listened to reports from the Munich crisis and wondered whether German armies would cross into Czechoslovakia. When a late listener heard military units being destroyed in New Jersey, the word Martian might not be the first explanation that remained in the mind. The person might hear attack, bombing, gas and evacuation, while missing the stranger parts of the report. Telephones rang in newspaper offices across the Northeast. Sunday evening staffs were usually smaller than weekday staffs, and many employees had not heard the programme. Editors and reporters began calling police departments, radio stations and one another. Some newspapers contacted CBS. Others sent staff members toward locations mentioned in the broadcast. The New York Times received hundreds of calls. At the New York Daily News, employees also tried to calm frightened listeners. Telephone operators at the New York Police Department were flooded with questions. Similar calls reached authorities in Newark, Jersey City, Philadelphia, Boston, and communities much farther from New Jersey. The calls did not arrive in an orderly form. One person asked whether the report was true. Another claimed to have seen smoke. Someone else had heard from a neighbour that an explosion had occurred. The next caller wanted directions to a safe road. An operator could say that there was no official report of an invasion, but the caller might answer that the radio had just interviewed military officers at the scene. That was the problem. The fictional broadcast sounded more complete than the information available to the real authorities. The Mercury Theatre had generals, professors, artillery batteries, aircraft, and reporters. The local police officer had a ringing telephone and no message from headquarters. At CBS, the reaction began reaching the studio while the performance continued. Network employees received calls asking whether the reports were real. Executives and supervisors moved toward the control room. The actors could see people gathering behind the studio glass, but they had to continue reading. Live radio did not stop simply because confusion had begun outside. The next cue arrived, the next actor approached the microphone, and the invasion continued. The company was told that announcements should be added to remind the audience that the programme was fictional. The first half of the show, however, had been timed closely. Interrupting the performance required finding an appropriate place, and the clearest announcement did not come until after the most intense sequence had ended. By then, some listeners were no longer beside their radios. They were calling neighbours, they were waking children, they were putting on coats. The most frightened reactions often began with concern for someone else. A listener might not believe that Martians were marching toward his own house, but he knew that a sister lived in New Jersey. A mother had a son working in New York. A husband had gone out for the evening and could not be reached. Fear moved through family networks faster than any official correction. A telephone call from a trusted relative carried its own authority. Imagine answering and hearing a brother say that New Jersey had been attacked. He does not begin by explaining that he heard this during a radio drama. He says, "Turn on the radio," or "Get out of the city," or "They're using gas." The person receiving the call hears urgency, not the source of the information. Then that person calls someone else. In apartment buildings, news passed through hallways and stairwells. A family listening upstairs knocked on the door below. Neighbours gathered around the best radio set. Some tuned to CBS and heard the later, more obviously dramatic portion of the story. Others found different stations carrying ordinary entertainment and could not understand why the entire radio system was not reporting the emergency. The normal programs on other stations should have reassured them, but fear can reverse the meaning of ordinary things. If one network reported an invasion while another continued with music, perhaps the second network had not received the news. Perhaps its telephone lines were down. Perhaps officials were trying to prevent panic. The absence of confirmation could be interpreted as delay or secrecy. Churches were among the places where the alarm entered suddenly. Sunday evening services were still in progress in some communities. People inside were not listening to radios and had heard none of the disclaimers. A frightened person arriving from outside could interrupt the service with a warning that the country had been attacked. One widely repeated report described a woman entering a church in Newark and telling the congregation that New York had been destroyed and that the end of the world had come. The statement sounded extreme, but the broadcast itself had described black smoke crossing Manhattan and a radio operator calling into silence after the city's station stopped answering. Someone who left the room before the later clarification could believe that millions of people had just died. The setting of a church intensified the moment. The congregation was already gathered in a place where people thought about death, judgment, safety, and the end of earthly life. A warning delivered through an open door could transform a routine service into a room of frightened questions. Ministers tried to calm people. Families looked for relatives. Some prayed. Others hurried outside to learn more. In certain homes, religious fear mixed with the memory of war. Older listeners had lived through 1917 and 1918, when troop movements, casualty lists, disease, and government announcements had entered everyday life. Gas warfare had been one of the great horrors of the First World War. The fictional black smoke in the broadcast did not sound like a fantasy weapon. To people who knew that real armies had used chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas against human beings. The gas masks mentioned during the programme made the invasion sound even more connected to modern warfare. Newspapers had shown civilians in Europe preparing for air raids. Governments distributed instructions about chemical attacks. Children in some countries practiced putting on masks. The audience did not need to believe in Martians to believe that poison gas could spread through a city. Some listeners decided that the safest place was outside. They left apartments, houses, restaurants, and social gatherings. Not everyone who stepped into the street was fleeing. Many simply wanted to see whether other people had heard the same report. They looked for smoke, military aircraft, unusual lights, or crowds moving in one direction. A quiet street could reassure them, but it could also feel suspiciously still. The sky on October 30th was not perfectly clear in every region, and ordinary lights could become alarming when people expected danger. An airplane crossing at a distance might seem connected to the reported military response. The glow of a factory, a railway yard, or a fire beyond the horizon could be interpreted as a burning town. Sirens from police vehicles responding to the sudden increase in calls sounded like evidence that the emergency had begun. A person searching the sky often found something to examine. The planet Mars was visible that evening, though no careful observer would have seen explosions from it with the naked eye. Stars flickered, clouds moved, aircraft lights appeared and disappeared. None of this was unusual, but the radio had changed the question people were asking. They were no longer looking at the sky to see what was there. They were looking for proof of what they had already heard. In New Jersey, the name Grover's Mill suddenly became nationally important. Before the broadcast, it was a small rural community in West Windsor Township near Princeton. Farms, scattered houses, narrow roads, and open land surrounded it. There was no crater, no cylinder, and no crowd burned by a heat ray. Most residents had no idea that their neighbourhood had been selected for destruction in a radio script. Calls began reaching the area. Reporters, police, and curious people wanted directions. Local residents stepped outside and found cars moving along roads that were usually quiet at that hour. Some went toward the supposed landing site. Others remained near their homes, listening for signs of trouble. The broadcast had placed the cylinder on the farm of a fictional man named Wilmoth, but no one could identify the actual property. That uncertainty did not stop people from searching. If the object had fallen near Grover's Mill, someone assumed that smoke, flames, soldiers, or crowds should be visible. Cars moved slowly through the dark countryside. Headlights swept across fields and barns. Police officers were sent to manage traffic and investigate reports. They found no Martians, but their presence added to the impression that something serious was happening. A driver arriving later saw police vehicles and assumed they had been called because the broadcast was true. The police were actually there because people believed it might be true. Grover's Mill soon became crowded enough that officers had to control access to some roads. Residents encountered strangers asking where the object had landed. People pointed toward fields based on guesses. Others repeated information heard over the radio, even though the broadcast had already moved far beyond the area. Later stories described armed farmers searching the countryside. Some accounts claim that people fired at a water tower because its shape resembled a Martian machine. These stories became part of the local legend, repeated so often that separating the original events from later additions became difficult. What is clear is that residents, reporters, and police did gather in the area, and that the quiet community was forced to respond to an invasion that existed only in sound. Elsewhere, automobiles became places of decision. A family who believed poisonous gas was approaching might load children into the car and drive away from the city, but where should they go? The fictional report said the highways were crowded, bridges were blocked, and machines were moving north. A driver with no map of the supposed invasion could only choose direction and hope. Gasoline mattered. Cars in 1938 did not always have full tanks, especially in families watching every dollar. A person preparing to flee might stop at a service station. Attendants heard rumours from customers and added them to what they had already heard. Several drivers arriving with the same story made the danger seem confirmed. Some people carried towels or cloths to cover their faces because the radio had mentioned poisonous smoke. Others packed food, money, clothing, or religious objects. Families made these choices in a few minutes. They did not organise as though they were beginning a long journey. They grabbed whatever seemed useful and moved. The highways did not become one unbroken national evacuation route. Traffic increased in some locations, and individual families drove from threatened areas, but the later image of millions of Americans abandoning their homes went far beyond what the evidence supports. That distinction was not visible to the people answering telephones that night. Each operator heard one frightened voice after another. Each police officer saw the group immediately in front of him. Each reporter collected dramatic examples because frightened people made better stories than calm people who had understood the broadcast. Hospitals received calls asking whether they were preparing for casualties. Doctors and nurses were warned by relatives. In some communities, volunteer organisations contacted one another. People offered to donate blood or assist refugees. The instinct to help appeared alongside the instinct to escape. College campuses produced their own confusion. Students moved between dormitories, radio rooms, and telephones. Princeton was close to the fictional landing site, and the broadcast had used the name of a Princeton professor. Calls reached the university asking about Professor Pearson, who did not exist. Staff members had to explain that no astronomer by that name worked there, and that no meteorite had fallen nearby. That response should have ended the matter for anyone who heard it directly. But explanations travelled more slowly than the alarm. Princeton says there is no Professor Pearson was less urgent than something has landed near Princeton. The correction lacked explosions, soldiers, and poison gas. It sounded weak beside the detailed world created by the broadcast. The same imbalance affected police statements. Authorities could say they had received no official report. A frightened caller answered that CBS had a reporter at the scene. Police could say the roads were open. Another caller claimed that military units had been destroyed. The fiction contained names, numbers, and locations. Reality had only the absence of evidence. Newspaper employees began recognizing the source of the confusion and told callers that they had heard a drama. Radio stations repeated announcements. CBS affiliates clarified that the Mercury Theatre was presenting a fictional adaptation. Police officers passed the correction to people who telephoned or gathered outside stations. For many listeners, the fear ended quickly. They returned to their radios and heard the later portion of the play. They tuned to another station and found no emergency. A neighbour explained what had happened. Someone laughed, although the laughter may have come after several uncomfortable minutes. Others remained suspicious. They had heard too much detail to accept that everything was invented. Perhaps the network had changed its story after government pressure. Perhaps the Martian explanation was false, but a military attack was real. Rumours rarely disappear all at once. They break into smaller rumours and continue moving. Inside the CBS studio, the broadcast shifted away from the rapid bulletins. Professor Pearson wandered through the imagined ruins and eventually encountered a stranger planning to rebuild society underground. The performance now sounded much more like a conventional drama. At the end, Orson Welles returned as himself and explained that the Mercury Theatre had dressed up in a sheet, jumped out of a bush, and said boo. It was a Halloween greeting from the company. By then, network officials were preparing for the consequences. Welles emerged from the studio and encountered a situation very different from the one he had entered. Police officers and reporters were waiting. CBS executives wanted answers. Telephone calls continued. The young director who had worried that the program might be boring was informed that parts of the country believed he had announced an actual invasion. He later said that he had been surprised. Photographs from that night and the following day show him facing reporters with an expression that could be read as shock, concern, calculation, or some mixture of all three. He apologized to listeners who had been frightened. He insisted that the company had not intended to deceive anyone and pointed to the announcements identifying the program as fiction. The reporters wanted to know whether he understood how realistic it sounded. Welles certainly understood by then. Outside, people were still returning home, replacing telephone receivers and explaining themselves to neighbours. Police departments continued answering calls long after the broadcast had ended. Newspapers prepared morning editions filled with stories of terror. Every dramatic incident moved quickly toward print, while the millions of people who had listened without becoming frightened remained mostly invisible. By midnight, the Martians were gone from the radio, but the public reaction had become the new story. Editors collected reports from churches, police stations, roads, and homes. They compared telephone numbers, repeated rumours, and looked for the most alarming language available. A broadcast that had lasted 1 hour was becoming evidence of a national panic before anyone had time to determine how many people had actually heard it, how long they had believed it, or what they had truly done. The fear had moved from Grover's Mill to the highways, but another force was now carrying it much farther. The morning newspapers were going to tell America what America had supposedly done. By Monday morning, the story had already become larger than the broadcast that created it. Newspapers across the United States told readers that the country had spent Sunday night in terror. Headlines described prayers, tears, traffic jams, fainting, flight, and people preparing for death. The image was irresistible. A young actor had announced that Martians were invading, and an entire nation had supposedly believed him. It was funny after the danger was known to be imaginary, frightening when considered as a demonstration of radio's power, and embarrassing enough that people repeated it for generations. There is only one problem. That version of the night is not entirely true. Real people were frightened. Real police telephone lines became crowded. Some listeners left their homes. Others rushed to churches, warned neighbours, or drove toward and away from places mentioned in the programme. None of that needs to be erased. The fear was not invented by later historians, and the listeners who experienced it were not imaginary figures created by newspaper editors. Yet the familiar picture of millions of Americans pouring into highways while Martian machines advanced through their radios is also not supported by the evidence. The honest answer is less dramatic and far more interesting. There was fear, confusion, and scattered action. But there was no single national panic unfolding in the same way everywhere. What happened depended on when a person tuned in, what words were heard, which people were trusted, how close the listener lived to New Jersey, and whether anyone took the simple step of turning to another station. To understand the scale, the first question should be obvious. How many people were listening? That question was difficult to answer precisely in 1938. There were no digital records showing exactly how many radios were tuned to a particular station at a particular second. Audience measurements relied on telephone surveys, interviews, and estimates. Different studies produced very different totals, and the largest numbers were repeated most often because they made the story more impressive. A survey of approximately 5,000 households conducted that evening by the CE. Hooper Rating Service found that only about 2% of those contacted were listening to the Mercury Theatre on the air. Most of those listeners understood that the programme was fictional. The Mercury Theatre was competing with Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, whose popular comedy programme attracted a much larger audience. This means that before anyone asks how many Americans panicked, we have to remember that the overwhelming majority of Americans were not listening to Orson Welles at all. They were listening to comedy, music, sermons, or other programs. Some had no radio turned on. Others were visiting friends, attending church, working, travelling, reading, or preparing for Monday morning. Millions of households passed through the evening without hearing the words Grover's Mill even once. Later estimates claimed that 9 to 12 million people heard at least some portion of the broadcast, and that perhaps 1 million became seriously frightened or took some kind of action. Those figures became common in histories of the event, but they were built from surveys and assumptions that did not always measure the same thing. Hearing part of the programme was not the same as believing it. Believing for a moment was not the same as panicking. Asking a police officer whether a report was true was not the same as loading a family into a car and fleeing the state. Those categories were repeatedly blended together. Suppose a woman heard that a meteorite had fallen near Princeton and telephoned her sister in New Jersey. Was she panicking, or was she checking on someone she loved? Suppose a man stepped onto his porch to look for smoke. Had he become hysterical, or was he attempting to verify what he heard? Suppose a family turned the dial, found ordinary music on another station, and immediately realised that CBS was broadcasting a play. They had been frightened for perhaps 30 seconds. Should they be counted among the victims of mass panic? The answer depended on who was counting and what story that person wanted to tell. Police records provide some of the clearest evidence that confusion was genuine. Telephone lines in New York, Trenton, Newark, and other cities received large numbers of calls. The New York Times reported hundreds of inquiries. The city manager of Trenton complained to the Federal Communications Commission that the reaction had seriously interfered with police communications. These were not imaginary consequences. Emergency lines were occupied, officers had to answer questions, and departments spent time responding to a crisis that did not exist. But a crowded switchboard does not tell us what every caller believed. Many called to ask whether the report was true. The act of calling showed uncertainty, not complete acceptance. Some callers may have been frightened, others were curious. A few may have been laughing and asking whether the police had arrested any Martians. Telephone operators heard all of them as calls, and newspapers later reported the total as evidence of panic. The same problem appears in accounts of crowded roads. Grover's Mill was a small rural community with limited road space. It did not require thousands of escaping families to create congestion. A modest number of police vehicles, reporters, curious residents, and people searching for the supposed meteorite could make the roads appear unusually busy. Later research found credible accounts of people driving toward Grover's Mill because they wanted to see what had fallen, including 2 Princeton professors. A crowd travelling toward the scene could easily be remembered or reported as a terrified population fleeing from it. That distinction changes the story considerably. Curiosity is not panic. Driving toward a reported meteorite may not have been wise, but it was the opposite of escape. Some people treated the broadcast as an opportunity to witness something extraordinary. They wanted to see the cylinder, the soldiers, or whatever else they believed might be waiting in the field. Local confusion still occurred. Police arrived because calls had been made. Reporters arrived because editors wanted information. Residents stepped outside because strangers were driving through their neighbourhood. Every new vehicle made the situation look more official. Someone seeing police on the road could assume that the police had confirmed the emergency, even when the officers were only investigating the same rumour. Similar feedback appeared elsewhere. A person heard the broadcast and called a neighbour. The neighbour went outside and saw several other people doing the same thing. That small gathering became evidence that everyone had heard something serious. A police car passed, perhaps on unrelated business, and the crowd decided the authorities were responding. A church bell rang at its usual time, but someone interpreted it as a warning. Fear did not require an actual Martian machine. It only required ordinary events to be rearranged by expectation. The strongest evidence for individual reactions survives in letters written after the programme. Listeners contacted CBS, the Mercury Theatre, Orson Welles, and the Federal Communications Commission. Some demanded punishment. Others defended the broadcast. Many described what they or their relatives had done. Because these letters came from people close to the event, they reveal a more complicated public than the one shown in the headlines. The main CBS station received 1,770 letters, and more than 1,000 were complimentary. The Mercury Theatre received roughly 1,450, with about 91% supporting or praising the programme. More than 600 letters, telegrams and petitions reached the FCC, where complaints were more common, although a substantial portion still defended Wells and opposed censorship. Some listeners had been frightened and remained angry. Others had been frightened, calmed down, and then admired the production that had fooled them. One woman began her letter in anger, and then added a small postscript after thinking about the programme. She admitted that it had been marvellous and offered her congratulations. Her response is useful because it does not fit neatly into either side of the legend. She had experienced fear, but she did not see herself as a helpless victim. Once she understood how the effect had been created, fear became admiration. When historian Abrad Schwartz examined approximately 1,400 letters preserved in the Orson Welles collection at the University of Michigan, he found that around 90% favoured Welles. Only about 6 described leaving home or taking similar physical action. The FCC's collection was more critical, but even there only a small number of writers described actually fleeing. The letters prove that people were frightened, yet they do not describe a country emptying its houses by the million. They also show that many Americans were more disturbed by the idea of government censorship than by the broadcast itself. Supporters warned the FCC not to punish radio drama because some listeners had misunderstood it. They argued that adults had a responsibility to pay attention, consult program listings, or listen for announcements. Others mocked the frightened audience in language that now sounds unnecessarily cruel. That cruelty became part of the public response. Once the invasion was known to be fictional, frightened listeners were easy targets. Newspapers and commentators described them as foolish, unstable, uneducated, or hopelessly gullible. The word panic made their actions seem automatic and irrational. It removed the need to ask what they had actually heard or why it had sounded believable. Hadley Cantrill, a psychologist at Princeton, attempted to answer those questions more seriously. Within days of the broadcast, he and his research team began interviewing listeners. Their study eventually included 135 detailed interviews, 100 of them with people already known to have been upset. Cantrill published the results in 1940 as The Invasion from Mars, a study in the psychology of panic. The study became enormously influential. Cantrill examined education, religious belief, economic insecurity, critical thinking, and the authority of radio. He asked why some people accepted the reports while others recognized the drama. His interviews preserved valuable testimony that might otherwise have disappeared, yet the study had a basic limitation when used to measure the scale of the national reaction. Most of the people interviewed had been selected because they were frightened. A sample built heavily from upset listeners could explain why those listeners reacted, but it could not accurately show what the entire American audience had done. Treating that group as representative made the panic appear larger and more uniform than it was. Cantrill's most valuable findings concerned verification. Listeners who checked the broadcast against an independent source were more likely to discover the truth. Turning to another station helped because other networks were carrying normal programming. Looking at a newspaper schedule could reveal that CBS had planned to broadcast The War of the Worlds. Recognizing H.G. Wells's story also offered protection. One 11-year-old girl remained calm because she knew the novel and understood what the title meant. Other forms of checking were less reliable. Calling a frightened relative merely connected one confused person with another. Stepping outside and asking neighbours could spread the report without testing it. Looking toward the horizon might produce smoke, lights, sirens, or traffic that seemed to confirm the danger. The source had changed, but the information had not. The authority of the fictional speakers also mattered. The broadcast included astronomers, professors, police officers, military commanders, government officials, and reporters. One listener explained that belief began as soon as the professor from Princeton and officials in Washington appeared. These were the kinds of people radio audiences expected to hear during an actual emergency. The characters did not sound certain from the beginning. Professor Pearson initially dismissed the possibility of life on Mars. The reporter struggled to explain what he saw. Military officers believed they could control the machines. Their doubt made them more believable. If everyone had immediately agreed that Martians were invading, the performance might have sounded like childish science fiction. Instead, trusted experts changed their minds as evidence appeared. Many frightened listeners did not believe in Martians at all. Some thought Germany had attacked the United States. Others believed a bombing raid or military disaster was underway. Certain listeners interpreted the broadcast through religious expectations and concluded that the end of the world had begun. The most extreme reactions often came from people who had not heard the original program directly. They received a shortened and altered version from friends or relatives. New Jersey has been attacked. Poison gas is spreading. New York is burning. Get out now. That second-hand warning removed the most obvious signs of fiction. A person who heard the Mercury Theatre announcement knew a drama was beginning. A person who received a frantic telephone call from a brother heard only danger. The trusted relationship replaced the radio network as the source. This is where the word gullible becomes particularly unfair. Most people do not verify every warning delivered by someone they love. If a relative telephoned late at night and said a chemical cloud was moving toward your neighbourhood, you might begin protecting your children before demanding a complete explanation of the source. Acting quickly under a mistaken belief can look foolish afterward, but the same action might appear responsible if the danger were real. Even the decision to leave home was not necessarily irrational within the fictional situation. The broadcast reported that military forces had been destroyed, poisonous smoke was spreading, and roads were becoming blocked. Anyone who accepted those facts would have little reason to remain quietly in the living room. Taking a car, gathering family members, and moving away from the reported danger would be a logical response. The irrational element lay in accepting the report without sufficient checking, not in trying to survive once it had been accepted. This distinction matters because panic is often described as a condition in which people lose the ability to make decisions and move as an uncontrolled crowd. Much of the documented behaviour on October 30th was more organised than that. People telephoned authorities, they sought relatives, they consulted neighbours, they turned the dial, they packed belongings. Their information was wrong, but their actions still had purposes. There were also many listeners who never believed the reports. Some recognised Wells's voice, others had heard the introduction. Radio enthusiasts understood the production techniques and admired how they were being used. Children familiar with the novel explained the programme to frightened adults. A few listeners became confused, checked another station, and settled the question almost immediately. These calm reactions rarely became newspaper stories. A family sitting quietly through a radio drama produced no police report. A man who turned the dial and discovered a comedy programme did not send a telegram to the FCC. A woman who laughed at the Martian heat ray did not attract reporters the following morning. The historical record naturally collected unusual behaviour, while ordinary understanding left almost no trace. That imbalance allowed dramatic examples to stand in for the entire audience. If reporters found 10 people who had fled their homes, those 10 became evidence that thousands had done so. If one church service was interrupted, headlines could describe churches filling across the country. A single traffic jam became highways clogged with refugees. Some stories were repeated without careful confirmation. Reports circulated of heart attacks, miscarriages, attempted suicides, and people injured while fleeing. Lawsuits were threatened. Many of the most sensational tales proved impossible to verify, or became more elaborate each time they were retold. That does not mean no one suffered emotional distress. Letters described people fainting, becoming ill, or requiring assistance. It means the evidence does not support the nationwide disaster suggested by the headlines. The newspaper industry had another reason to emphasise the danger. Radio was becoming a serious competitor for advertising and public attention. Newspapers had once served as the main source of immediate information for most Americans. Now radio could deliver news faster and carry voices directly into the home. A dramatic example of radio irresponsibility allowed editors to argue that broadcasting lacked proper control and could not be trusted during a real emergency. Media historians have therefore suggested that competition helped shape the coverage. Newspapers did not need to invent every frightened listener. They only had to select the most dramatic reports, arrange them beneath enormous headlines, and treat scattered confusion as a national breakdown. The Library of Congress notes that this sensational reporting helped establish the lasting belief that widespread panic had occurred. Radio also benefited from the legend in a different way. A medium powerful enough to terrify a nation was clearly a medium that mattered. CBS faced criticism, but the story demonstrated how deeply radio had entered American life. The Mercury Theatre, previously unable to find a sponsor, soon gained one. Orson Welles became internationally famous. The same reports that accused him of irresponsibility made his name impossible to ignore. Wells eventually learned to live comfortably with the legend. In the immediate aftermath, he appeared concerned that he might face lawsuits, government action, or damage to his career. In later years, he sometimes described the reaction with greater drama, speaking as though homes had emptied and churches had filled across the country. The larger the panic became, the larger the man who had created it appeared. By then, the story no longer belonged only to the people who experienced the night. It belonged to journalism textbooks, radio histories, documentaries, school lessons, and popular memory. Each retelling simplified the question. Did Americans panic? Yes, the familiar account answered, and then it moved directly to the photographs of Wells facing reporters. The evidence asks us to remain in the uncertainty a little longer. Some Americans panicked. More became briefly afraid. Many were confused but checked the report. Others heard only part of the story from someone they trusted. Large numbers enjoyed the performance from beginning to end. Most of the country did not hear it at all. That mixture is not as clean as the legend, but it explains human behaviour more honestly. People were not controlled by the radio like machines. They interpreted what they heard through personal experience, education, religion, geography, family relationships, and existing fears. The same words entered thousands of homes and produced thousands of slightly different stories. The night revealed the power of radio, but it also revealed the power of repetition after the event. The broadcast frightened a limited portion of its audience for a limited amount of time. The reports about the panic reached far more people and lasted much longer. By sunrise, printing presses were carrying those reports into cities and towns that had never heard the Mercury Theatre. Americans opened their newspapers and learned that they had supposedly spent the previous evening running from Martians. The invasion on the radio was over. The argument over who should be blamed was only beginning. The argument over who should be blamed began before most Americans had finished breakfast. Newspaper presses had worked through the night, collecting reports from police stations, telephone exchanges, churches, radio offices, and frightened individuals. Editors had little time to investigate every claim. They had something better for the front page: Martians, mass fear, and a 23-year-old theatrical director whose serious voice had apparently sent the United States running into the streets. The headlines were enormous. The New York Times announced that radio listeners had panicked after mistaking a war drama for fact. The New York Daily News told readers that a false radio war had stirred terror across the country. Other papers described prayers, tears, flight, overloaded police lines, and families abandoning their homes. The Chicago Herald and Examiner placed the story prominently on its front page. Local newspapers repeated whatever incidents they could gather, even when the reports had passed through several people before reaching a reporter. For anyone who had slept through the broadcast, the morning papers created a strange experience. A person might walk outside, collect the newspaper, unfold it over the breakfast table, and discover that the nation had supposedly lost control the previous night. Perhaps nobody in the house had listened to CBS. Perhaps the family had been laughing at Charlie McCarthy, attending church, or sleeping. Yet the headline insisted that something historic had happened while they were occupied elsewhere. The newspaper story was far larger than the original audience. That helped turn a limited and uneven reaction into a national event. The Mercury Theatre had reached only a portion of radio listeners. The headlines reached almost everyone who read newspaper. People who had never heard the voices from Grover's Mill now learned that those voices had terrified millions. They repeated the story at work, in shops, on streetcars, and in schoolrooms. By Monday afternoon, the public was not merely discussing the broadcast. It was discussing what the broadcast supposedly proved about the American people. Some newspapers treated the event with humour. Cartoonists drew Martians holding microphones, or families fleeing harmless radio cabinets. Columnists joked about listeners who believed creatures from Mars had crossed New Jersey in fighting machines. The embarrassed people who had called police stations became easy targets, because the danger had disappeared. Fear that seemed reasonable for several minutes on Sunday night looked ridiculous in the daylight. Other editorials were much more severe. They accused CBS of irresponsibility and argued that radio had demonstrated its ability to mislead the public. The broadcast, they said, had copied the language and structure of real news too closely. It had used familiar place names, military descriptions, government officials, and interrupted music. Announcements that identified the programme as fiction had been made, but late listeners could miss them. Radio had entered nearly every home, and now the industry had shown what could happen when dramatic realism was allowed to borrow the authority of journalism. Behind some of this criticism was a struggle between two forms of media. Newspapers had once controlled most of the nation's fast-moving news. Radio now delivered information more quickly, carried the actual voices of political leaders, and competed for advertising money. Newspaper offices had also received hundreds of calls during the broadcast, which made the reaction appear especially large to the journalists inside them. Faced with reports arriving from several cities at once, editors could easily conclude that a nationwide breakdown was taking place. Whatever their motive, the huge headlines gave the panic legend a reach the radio drama itself had never possessed. Orson Welles spent the final hours of Sunday night rehearsing another production. He was preparing Georg Büchner's Danton's Death with the Mercury Theatre, and the work continued into the morning. The young director had completed one live broadcast and moved almost immediately into another demanding task, even while reporters searched for him and CBS employees tried to understand what had happened. On Monday, October the 31st, Welles entered a room crowded with journalists and newsreel cameras. He looked exhausted. His hair was untidy, his eyes were heavy, and he spoke with a seriousness very different from the playful Halloween message he had delivered at the end of the broadcast. Photographs and film from the press conference became almost as famous as the radio programme. They showed Welles seated among reporters, facing questions that suggested people had died, been injured, or driven into danger because of his work. The questions came quickly. Had he known that listeners would believe the reports? Why had the Mercury Theatre used real American locations? Why had the government official sounded like President Roosevelt? Should the news bulletin method have been softened? Was the entire thing a publicity stunt? Welles insisted that the company had never expected such a reaction. H.G. Wells's novel was famous. The programme had been announced as a drama, and the fictional nature of the performance had been stated on the air. He expressed regret that anyone had misunderstood it. He also defended the basic decision to present the story with force. A murder in a play could not be made harmless merely by using softer words, and an invasion story could not work if everyone sounded relaxed. The newsreel record shows a young man trying to appear responsible, while a room full of journalists examined whether he had discovered a dangerous new use for radio. Was he truly shocked? That question has followed Welles ever since. Some people who knew him believed that his regret was sincere. He was ambitious and theatrical, but a national scandal could have destroyed the Mercury Theatre, ended his radio career, and exposed CBS to lawsuits. At 23, he had no reason to assume that the authorities would simply forgive him. His exhaustion was real, and the first reports reaching the company had included rumours of deaths and serious injuries. Others saw performance in the press conference. Welles was an actor sitting before cameras, and he understood the value of a strong public image. His lowered eyes, careful pauses, and solemn voice made him look like an unusually gifted young artist who had created something more powerful than even he could control. Whether every emotion was spontaneous or not, he handled the room well. He apologised without admitting deliberate deception, defended artistic realism without insulting frightened listeners, and emerged from the scandal looking dangerous enough to be interesting but not cruel enough to be rejected. CBS issued explanations and repeated that the broadcast had been a dramatisation. The network pointed to the announcements made during the programme and argued that the Mercury Theatre had followed accepted dramatic practices. At the same time, CBS could not simply dismiss the reaction. Police communication systems had been disrupted. Newspaper and network switchboards had been overwhelmed. Public officials were demanding answers. Letters began arriving almost immediately. The main CBS station in New York eventually received 1,770 letters about the broadcast. Another 1,450 reached the Mercury Theatre. More than 600 letters, telegrams and petitions were sent to the Federal Communications Commission. Some were written in anger, others praised the production. Together, they provide one of the clearest pictures of how divided the public became after the Martians disappeared. The complaints described wives becoming ill, children crying, neighbours rushing into the street, and police officers losing access to important telephone lines. The city manager of Trenton told the FCC that the broadcast had crippled police communications for hours. Other writers asked the government to punish CBS, remove the Mercury Theatre from the air, or prevent any future drama from imitating a news report. Many of these people did not care whether Wells had intended to cause fear. They judged the production by what had happened in their homes. A mother who had watched her children panic was not likely to admire the timing of Frank Reddick's performance. A police officer answering repeated calls about poison gas had little interest in the artistic value of simulated field reporting. From their point of view, an entertainment programme had entered private homes under the appearance of emergency news and created unnecessary danger. Yet the supporting letters were just as passionate. Of the letters sent to the main CBS station, 1,086 were complimentary. Approximately 91% of those received by the Mercury Theatre praised or defended the programme. Even among the letters sent to the FCC, where complaints naturally collected, roughly 40% supported Wells or opposed punishment. Listeners called the broadcast exciting, intelligent, and brilliantly produced. Some requested that CBS air it again. Others warned that government interference would damage radio drama far more seriously than one mistaken broadcast had damaged the public. The language of the supporters could be harsh. Some mocked frightened listeners as foolish or unfit to own radios. They argued that anyone who had paid attention would have heard the title, recognised the Mercury Theatre, or noticed the impossible speed of the invasion. A 12-year-old boy wrote that he had enjoyed the programme even though his mother and sister became frightened and made him turn it off. Adults used the incident to congratulate themselves on remaining calm. This reaction created another kind of fear. People began asking what the misunderstanding revealed about democracy. Europe was filled with dictators who understood the political power of radio. Adolf Hitler's speeches reached enormous audiences, while state-controlled broadcasting repeated propaganda and discouraged competing information. If an American dramatic company could convince some listeners that Martians were attacking, what might a government or political movement accomplish with deliberate lies repeated every day? Several defenders of Wells believed the broadcast had provided a useful warning. Radio itself was not the danger, they argued. Unquestioning trust was the danger. Punishing a play would not teach people to verify information. It would merely give officials greater control over what could be broadcast. The Federal Communications Commission stood in the middle of this argument. Established in 1934, the agency regulated interstate radio communication and licensed stations to operate in the public interest. Many angry letter writers assumed that the FCC could simply censor future programs. The law, however, specifically limited the Commission's ability to control broadcast content in ways that interfered with freedom of expression. The agency could investigate whether CBS had violated its responsibilities, but it could not casually become a government office reading and approving every script before airtime. Calls for hearings and stricter control followed. Some politicians suggested that realistic dramatization should be reviewed in advance. Others demanded clearer warnings whenever fictional programs used the form of news. The most severe proposals would have required the government to examine broadcasts before the public heard them, an idea that alarmed performers, writers, and defenders of free expression. Singer and comedian Eddie Cantor sent a telegram opposing censorship. Other writers told the FCC that one error in judgment was less dangerous than a system allowing officials to decide what could be performed. They understood that rules created for Martians might later be used against political drama, satire, criticism, or controversial news. The investigation lasted a little more than a month. On December 5th, the FCC announced that it would not sanction the broadcast. Wells and CBS received no formal punishment. The decision recognised that the programme had been identified as fiction, and that the network had taken steps intended to prevent another misunderstanding. The Commission avoided creating a new rule that might function as advanced censorship, although broadcasters became more cautious about programmes that imitated emergency announcements. The lack of punishment did not mean that nothing changed. Networks and stations understood that simulated news carried responsibilities unlike ordinary drama. Clearer announcements became more important. Real names, emergency signals, and official voices had to be handled carefully. Radio professionals now knew that the conventions they used to establish credibility could create confusion when transferred too completely into fiction. The legal threats also faded. Several listeners discussed lawsuits, and claims of injuries appeared in newspapers, but no great courtroom battle established Wells as a public menace. The most alarming reports of death, suicide, and serious physical harm were difficult or impossible to confirm. The damage that could be documented was largely emotional and practical. Fear inside some homes, congested roads in a few places, interrupted telephone services, and hours of work for police, newspapers, and radio employees. For the Mercury Theatre, the consequences were almost embarrassingly positive. Before October 30th, the programme had struggled to find a sponsor. It offered ambitious literary productions against more popular comedy and variety shows. Its audience was respectable, but limited. After the broadcast, everyone knew the name Orson Welles. People who had never listened to the Mercury Theatre wanted to hear what he would do next. Campbell Soup agreed to sponsor the programme, which was renamed the Campbell Playhouse. The sponsored series began on December 9th, 1938, with an adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. Wells now had to include commercials and work with advertising representatives, but he also had funding, well-known guest stars, and a much larger audience. The scandal that might have removed him from radio had made his radio work commercially valuable. The change produced one of the stranger images in Wells's career. The man accused of terrifying the country with Martian death machines was now expected to praise Soup. He could introduce an important novel, direct respected actors, and create an ambitious radio drama, but the evening also had to contain cheerful assurances about chicken, tomato, or pea soup. American broadcasting had absorbed the dangerous young artist in the most American manner possible. It gave him a sponsor. Hollywood noticed him as well. RKO Pictures eventually offered Wells an extraordinary motion picture agreement. He would be allowed unusual freedom to produce, direct, write, and act in films. The path from that contract led to Citizen Kane, released in 1941 and later regarded as one of the most influential films ever made. The War of the Worlds broadcast was not the only reason Hollywood wanted him, since his theatre and radio work had already established his reputation, but the nationwide publicity proved that he could command attention on a scale few young directors could match. Howard Koch also moved toward Hollywood, where his later screenwriting work included Casablanca. John Houseman continued a long career in theatre, film, education, and acting. Bernard Herrmann became one of the most important film composers of the 20th century. The actors, writers, musicians, and sound technicians who'd created the broadcast moved into other projects, though most would forever be introduced in connection with the night Martians landed in New Jersey. H.G. Wells, whose novel had supplied the invasion, initially regarded the American excitement with some uncertainty. In 1940, he and Orson Welles met during a radio interview in Texas. By then, the author could joke about the incident, and the younger Wells was more inclined to reduce the scale of the panic than enlarge it. Book sales and international attention had helped transform the unauthorized-seeming American experiment into useful publicity for the original story. The two men with almost identical surnames could finally discuss the event together, one having imagined the Martians and the other having brought them through the radio. The legend continued to grow after the people involved had moved on. In 1940, Princeton psychologist Hadley Cantrell published The Invasion from Mars, presenting the broadcast as a major study in mass panic. His team had interviewed 135 people, 100 of whom were already known to have been upset. The study offered valuable insights into why certain listeners believed what they heard, but its estimates of the national reaction were later questioned. Because the sample concentrated so heavily on frightened people, it could explain their behaviour more effectively than it could measure the behaviour of the whole country. For decades, however, Cantrell's account and the original newspaper stories remained the easiest sources to find. They reinforced one another. Newspapers said the nation had panicked. The study explained why the panic had occurred. Textbooks repeated both. Documentaries dramatised fleeing families, crowded roads, and churches filled with terrified people. The limited evidence of calm listeners remained scattered in private letters and archives. The story became too useful to examine closely. Teachers used it to demonstrate the power of radio. Journalists used it as a warning about irresponsible reporting. Psychologists used it to discuss suggestion and fear. Broadcasters used it to celebrate the realism of old radio drama. Critics of mass media used it as proof that audiences could be controlled. Admirers of Wells used it to show that he had been a genius before Hollywood ever allowed him near a camera. Even Wells eventually contributed to the larger version. In later interviews, he sometimes described houses emptying, churches filling, and fear spreading across the country. The claims helped preserve his image as a magician who understood the public better than the public understood itself. At other times, he dismissed the whole event as exaggerated. Both versions suited him. One made him powerful, the other made him amused by everyone else's need to enlarge the story. Modern researchers returned to the surviving letters and audience surveys and found something much less tidy. The broadcast did cause genuine fear, but the national panic had been overstated. The most extreme reactions were rare. Many people had enjoyed the programme, and many of those initially confused checked another source and quickly understood the truth. The larger wave of anxiety arrived the next morning, when Americans read that their fellow citizens had been easily manipulated and began worrying about what that meant for the country. That may be the most important part of the lasting legend. The original false report concerned Martians. The second false impression concerned Americans. One story claimed that alien machines were destroying New Jersey. The other suggested that the entire population had responded without reason. The first lasted less than an hour. The second survived for decades. The broadcast remained famous because it contained enough truth to keep the legend alive. Some listeners did believe. Some families did leave home. Police lines did become crowded. People did warn friends and relatives. The event cannot simply be dismissed as a newspaper invention. At the same time, it cannot honestly be described as a nation losing its mind. Most Americans never heard the program. Most who heard it understood that it was fiction. Many who became frightened remained beside the radio until a disclaimer or a second source corrected the mistake. The story survives between those two realities. In 2002, the Library of Congress selected The War of the Worlds, broadcast for the National Recording Registry, recognizing it as a recording of lasting cultural, historical, and artistic importance. It can now be heard not merely as evidence of a scare, but as one of the most carefully produced works of American radio drama. The ordinary dance music, hesitant field reporting, controlled interruptions, dead telephone lines, and moments of silence still work because the production understood how listeners create pictures from sound. Listen to it now, and the technology sounds old. There is static. The voices use the formal pronunciation of 1930s broadcasting. The Martian machines exist only through metal noises and description. A modern listener knows the story before the first bulletin begins. Yet the central experience is not old at all. A trusted form of communication delivers an alarming claim. People receive incomplete pieces of information. Some verify them. Others pass them to relatives. Familiar voices make the story feel credible. Existing fears shape what each person believes. Reports about the public reaction become larger than the event itself. Arguments begin over censorship, responsibility, and whether audiences should blame the speaker or themselves. The wooden cabinet has changed. The speed has changed. The number of voices has multiplied beyond anything a family in 1938 could have imagined. But the choice beside the radio remains familiar. A voice enters the room. It sounds urgent. It knows the names of nearby places. It tells you that everyone else is already reacting. And before you repeat what it says, you have only a moment to decide whether the danger is outside your window or somewhere inside the story being told.